3 seconds after a Navy SEAL sat down across from a disabled nurse, his combat dog stood up and blocked the only exit. The dog had survived 7 deployments across 2 war zones and had never once moved without a command, but now he planted himself between the nurse's wheelchair and the cafeteria door, like he was guarding something he already understood. The man near the vending machines hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He was just pointing his phone slowly, deliberately at the woman everyone else in the room had learned to ignore. When the dog growled, the cafeteria went completely still, and the woman in the wheelchair, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in months, said clearly, "He's been following me for 11 days. This story already has you holding your breath. Stay with me until the very end." Like this video, subscribe so you never miss another story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Cafeteria at Coastal View Medical Center in Pensacola, Florida, smelled like burned coffee and industrial floor cleaner, which was more or less the same smell it had carried for the past 4 years. Nora Voss had memorized it the way you memorize the sound of a faulty radiator, not because you want to, but because you stop being able to ignore it after enough time. She arrived at the same table every Tuesday at 11:45, pushed herself to the window corner where the light came in at the right angle, and ordered the same thing: black coffee, no food. Staff knew her order. They also knew, in the careful and non-committal way that hospital staff learn to know things, that she used to work here, and that something had happened, and that asking about it was not a welcome subject. Nora was 38 years old. She had a master's degree in trauma nursing, 2 years of specialized training with military field units in Georgia and Virginia, and a clinical record that, until 22 months ago, had never carried a single disciplinary notation. Now she had a spinal cord injury listed on her medical file as idiopathic onset, progressive, which was a precise and clinical way of saying that no one had ever satisfactorily explained why she'd lost partial use of both legs during a shift that began normally and ended with her on the floor. Ply corridor outside the neurology wing. She didn't talk about it. She came here on Tuesdays because her outpatient physical therapy was 2 floors up, because the coffee was marginally better than what the therapy waiting room offered, and because sitting here in the place where she used to move fast and matter was the only way she'd found to keep herself from disappearing entirely. The dog noticed her before the man did. She heard the click of nails on linoleum, first a distinctive, measured cadence, heavier than most service animals, with a deliberate weight to each step that made people instinctively move out of the way, without quite knowing why. When she looked up, she saw a black German shepherd moving through the cafeteria entrance with the focused, unhurried calm of an animal that had been trained to walk through far worse environments than a hospital lunchroom. He was large, maybe 95 pounds, with a working harness in military tan that had clearly been used in actual field conditions, not the clean, unscuffed vests she saw on most therapy dogs. His eyes swept the room in a single practiced arc. Behind him came the man. He wasn't what she expected, though she couldn't have said what she expected. He was maybe 43, 44, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and dark pants, with the kind of physical stillness that doesn't come from calm personality, but from years of practicing it deliberately. There was a scar along his left jawline, old and fully healed, and he walked with a very slight comcented gait in his right leg, the kind that a trained eye catches and a non-clinical eye reads as perfectly normal. He was carrying 2 coffees in a cardboard tray and scanning the room with the same efficient assessment his dog had just completed. Most of the tables were occupied. He moved through the room without hesitation, stopped 2 feet from her table, and looked at the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" She hadn't been asked that in a long time. People tended to drift past her table, selecting other options, and she'd long since stopped being bothered by it. She looked at him for a moment, reading the question for any subtext and finding none. "It's a free country," she said. He sat. The dog immediately positioned himself beside her wheelchair on the left side, not touching her, not performing any particular behavior, just present and settled, the way a very large and very calm animal can be present. She looked down at him. He looked back up at her with brown eyes that carried a quality she recognized, the particular steadiness of someone who had seen enough of the world that almost nothing registered as alarming anymore. "Atlas," the man said. Not a command, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if completing an introduction that the dog had already started. "He's military," she said. Was he set one of the coffees closer to her side of the table without being asked? "Retired 9 months ago. I'm Marcus Hale." She didn't move toward the coffee immediately. "Nora Voss, I know," he said. She went still. He held up one hand unhurried. "The front desk." They said a former staff member usually has this corner on Tuesdays. He paused. I wasn't tracking you. I was looking for someone to sit with who wasn't going to try to make conversation about my dog for 40 minutes. Strange enough answer that she almost believed it. She studied him, the posture, the hands, the way he held eye contact without pushing. He wasn't performing ease. He was actually at ease, which in her experience was rarer than people thought. Picked up the coffee. Seal, she said. 8 years. Then I got out. Why? Wrong question, he said mildly. Right question is why I waited as long as I did. She almost smiled. Didn't quite make it. What brings you to Coastal View? Atlas has a follow-up with the rehab unit. He took shrapnel in his left shoulder 2 years ago. They do a 6-month mobility check. He glanced down at the dog, who was still stationed beside her with an attentiveness that struck her as disproportionate to the situation. He usually ignores people he doesn't know. She looked down at Atlas. The dog looked back at her, with the same quiet focus he'd had since he sat down, and there was something in it that was difficult to name, a quality of attention that felt less like the trained alert of a working animal and more like recognition. As if he had already formed a conclusion about her, and the conclusion was favorable. Animals sometimes respond to wheelchairs, she said. Positioned lower. Less intimidating. That's not what this is, Marcus said. She didn't push it. They sat in a silence that was, against all reasonable expectation, not uncomfortable. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The cafeteria moved around them at its ordinary pace, nurses on break, maintenance staff, a handful of visitors carrying flower arrangements that still had the gift shop plastic on them. She was aware in her peripheral vision that the physical therapist who occasionally checked on her between sessions had noted her table companion with a visible degree of surprise. It was the dog that changed everything. Atlas shifted. Not dramatically, he didn't lunge or bark or do anything that would register as alarming if you weren't watching carefully. He simply moved from beside her wheelchair to a position directly between her and the far side of the cafeteria, turned his body perpendicular to the room, and lowered his head. It was a small repositioning that took less than 3 seconds. But it transformed his posture entirely from relaxed to braced, and the difference was readable if you knew what you were looking at. Marcus set his coffee down. Nora followed his gaze without moving her head, using the window's reflection, a habit she'd developed over the past months, without consciously deciding to. The vending machines near the secondary entrance, a man in a visitor's badge and a dark jacket was holding his phone horizontally, pointed at her table. He wasn't looking at the vending machines. He wasn't looking at anything except the screen. Don't turn toward him, Marcus said quietly. I wasn't going to, she said. Her voice was steady. He's been following me for 11 days. A beat of silence. You know him? No. But I know the pattern. She brought her coffee cup to her lips, so her mouth was partially obscured. Same jacket, different shoes. He's been outside PT twice, once in the parking structure, and now here. He always has the phone. Marcus didn't look alarmed. He looked focused, which was different, a narrowing of attention that removed everything unnecessary. Hoard it? To whom? He didn't answer that, which told her he understood the actual meaning of the question. Atlas remained in his braced position, head low, gaze fixed on the man near the vending machines. His stillness was absolute, the complete, coiled stillness of an animal that has learned the difference between a threat that is still forming and one that has committed to action and is patiently waiting to determine which this is. The man with the phone made a mistake then. He shifted his angle, stepping sideways to improve his shot, and in doing so moved toward a gap between 2 tables that put him closer to the exit and between Nora and the door. Atlas moved before Marcus said a word. He didn't charge. He walked, but it was a walk with a purpose so explicit that 3 separate people near the vending machines stepped back without being asked. Placed himself directly in the man's path, sat down and stared at him. Not growling, not baring teeth. Just sitting there with the weight of his entire attention bearing down on the man like a physical pressure. The man froze. Sir, Marcus said, not loudly, crossing the room with the same unhurried precision as his dog. Phone down, please. I wasn't. This is a public space. Phone down. The tone carried something that had nothing to do with volume. The man lowered the phone. Around him, the cafeteria had gone into that particular quality of silence where people are not looking at the source of tension, but are intensely aware of it. The man tried to step around Atlas. Atlas moved with him, perfectly mirroring his step, maintaining the block without contact. He's not going to let you leave, Marcus said. He wasn't threatening. He was informing. Not until I understand what you're doing. I wasn't doing anything. The man's voice had risen into a register that didn't belong to someone with a clean conscience. You were filming a specific person in a medical facility for the third time in 2 weeks, Nora said from her table. The man turned toward her. His face changed when he looked at her. Something flashed across it that wasn't fear and wasn't surprise, but was the specific expression of a person whose instructions have just intersected with the reality they were supposed to be covert about. It was a single, low sound barely audible across the room, but it was enough. The man stopped moving entirely. Security arrived 3 minutes later, 2 officers who were used to minor cafeteria disputes and were visibly not prepared for the particular configuration they encountered. They took the man's bag at Marcus's request. The man protested through the entire process with the sustained energy of someone who knows they're losing and has decided volume is the only remaining leverage. Mattered. While one officer held the man's arms, the other opened the bag's standard protocol, consented to under duress, and found a phone with an active live stream, a secondary recording device no larger than a thick pen, a folded printout with what appeared to be a daily schedule, and a handwritten note on Coastal View Medical Center letterhead that contained a single line, confirm subject location before 1300 daily. Dr. Vale requires continuous. Nora read it from 6 feet away and felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with vertigo. She knew the name. Dr. Callum Vale was the senior attending in the neurology department. He had been at Coastal View for 11 years. He had a published body of research in neuromodulation therapies for traumatic brain injury, 3 federal grants, and a reputation within the hospital hierarchy that functioned as a kind of atmospheric pressure ever present, difficult to push against, shaping the way everyone in his orbit moved and spoke. He'd been the attending physician on call the night Nora collapsed in the supply corridor. She'd always known that. She had never been able to prove what it meant. Marcus appeared beside her wheelchair. He didn't ask how she was. He looked at the note in the security officer's hand and then at her, and his expression said what he already understood without her explaining it. "Who's Vale?" he said. "My neurologist," she said. Then after a pause, "And the person who made sure I never worked again." He absorbed that. "He's monitoring you. He has been." Couldn't prove it. She looked at the man now being held near the secondary entrance, still talking, still insisting, still performing a version of innocence that had entirely run out of credibility. Until now. The security officers called the floor manager. The floor manager called the chief administrative officer on duty. The note on hospital letterhead complicated things significantly, and within 20 minutes the conversation had moved out of the cafeteria and into a corridor where administrative language was deployed at length to describe a situation that was, in its plainest terms, a physician using hospital resources to surveil a disabled former employee. Marcus stayed near her through all of it, not hovering, not inserting himself. He stood at a distance that said present. Without saying protective, the distinction mattered to her, and she noticed it. Atlas remained close to her wheelchair with the same settled attention he'd maintained since the moment he first positioned himself beside her. She gave a statement to the floor security supervisor, factual, organized, without embellishment. Yes, she recognized the pattern of surveillance. Yes, she could identify specific dates and locations. No, she did not know why Dr. Vale was monitoring her. That last part was a careful omission, and she made it deliberately, because the full answer to that question was not something she was ready to deliver in a hallway to a security supervisor whose authority stopped at the edges of the building. What she knew, what she had known for 22 months and had not been able to make anyone hear, was that doctor. Callum Vale was running a research program inside Coastal View that was not in any ethics review file, was not disclosed to the patients it involved, and that had been targeting a specific population. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries who were being transferred to Coastal View through a contract arrangement with the military medical referral system. She had discovered it by accident. She had been working a night shift in the neuro recovery ward when she pulled the wrong chart, a file that was labeled for a standard TBI recovery patient but contained protocol documentation for something that bore no resemblance to standard TBI recovery. She had photographed 3 pages before she fully understood what she was reading. She'd been on her way to report it when she collapsed. That was the part she'd never been able to prove wasn't an accident. The floor supervisor thanked her for her statement, told her someone from administration would be in touch, and moved on to managing the logistics of the detained man, who was eventually handed to a Pensacola PD officer who had been called as a formality and who looked like he was having a quietly terrible afternoon. Nora maneuvered her chair back toward the window corner. Marcus followed. He sat down across from her again, and Atlas settled beside her again, as if the last 45 minutes had simply been a brief interruption to a conversation they'd all agreed to continue. You're not surprised, she said. I've seen organized surveillance before, he said. It has a smell. He was too calm until he wasn't. I meant about Vale. She wrapped both hands around her now cold coffee. Most people hear the doctor monitoring me, and their first reaction is to find a reason it makes sense. I've also heard the doctor monitoring me from people who weren't wrong, he said. She looked at him. Why are you still here? Because Atlas didn't move when the security team showed up, he said. And that's unusual. He glanced down at the dog, who had not shifted position. Still thinks this isn't resolved. She followed his gaze. Atlas was alert, not braced, not growling, but with that particular posture of residual attention that said whatever threat he'd identified was not fully accounted for by the man now being walked out of the building. She was about to say something when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. Text contained 4 words. He has your files. She showed it to Marcus without speaking. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction. Who else knew you had files on Vale? No one, she said. Unless she stopped. Turned the phone over once in her hands. Unless Vale already knew I had them. Which means he's known for a long time. And he's been waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't answer immediately. She looked out through the cafeteria window, at the midday light on the parking lot, the ordinary, indifferent brightness of a Tuesday in Florida, and thought about the photograph she'd taken 22 months ago, currently stored on an encrypted drive she kept in a drawer at her apartment, behind a false panel she'd installed herself, and about what it meant that someone with Vale's access and resources had spent 22 months monitoring her rather than acting. He doesn't know where they are, she said. He knows I have them. He doesn't know where. She paused. That's why he's been watching instead of moving. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That changes the situation. Yes, she said. Because if he's escalating to a watcher and a live stream, he's done being patient. Yes, she said again. Atlas raised his head. The sound reached them a second later, not loud, not alarming to anyone who didn't know what it meant. The specific, coordinated tap of hard-soled shoes moving in a formation that had nothing to do with hospital foot traffic. 3 men came through the main cafeteria entrance without pausing at the doorway. They were wearing visitor lanyards. They were not visitors. The tallest one, moving at the front, looked directly at Nora and didn't look away. Ms. Voss, he said, crossing the room with the flat, purposeful courtesy of someone who expects compliance and has been authorized to obtain it. Dr. Vale would like to see you. Marcus stood up from his chair before the man had finished speaking. Quickly, not with any particular aggression. He simply stood, and the simple fact of his height and the position he took between them and her changed the geometry of the room. She's in the middle of something, Marcus said. The man barely glanced at him. This doesn't involve you. He's right, said one of the other 2, and his hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, in a motion that was subtle and specific and unmistakable. Came off the floor. He didn't bark. He moved between the 2 men on the flanks, low and fast, and the second man's hand stopped moving. The first man took an involuntary step back, and in the half-second of stillness that followed the kind that falls over a room when something has just happened that no one has fully processed, yet Nora pulled out her phone and pressed the voice memo record button. You're in a hospital cafeteria, she said, her voice completely level, with witnesses, cameras, a combat-trained military working dog, and at least one of you is carrying a concealed firearm in a medical facility, which is a felony in this state. So, before you say another word, I'd like to understand what Dr. Vale thinks happens next. The man at the front stared at her, stared back. 22 months in a wheelchair had taught her, among other things, that stillness was not the same as weakness, and that the people who confused the two consistently underestimated her. She let them underestimate her now. She kept her hands visible, her expression neutral, and the record button running. It was Marcus who broke the standoff not by escalating, but by reaching into his pocket and producing a laminated card that he held out with 2 fingers, the way you'd offer a document in a formal setting. He didn't hand it over. He just made it visible. The man at the front looked at it. Something changed in his face, a recalibration that moved from confidence to a more complicated position. Whatever was on that card, it was enough. We'll be in contact, the first man said. He made it sound like a threat. He also stepped back when he said it, which undermined the effect considerably. 3 men left. The cafeteria returned slowly to its ordinary sounds, the coffee machine, a distant intercom page, cutlery on plates. Nora let out a breath she hadn't been aware she was holding. What was on the card, she said. Marcus put it back in his pocket. Federal contractor credential, outdated by about 4 months, but they didn't know that. She looked at him. You're not just out here for Atlas's appointment. He met her eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, the particular pause of a person deciding how much of a truth to release at once. No, he said finally. I'm not. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document on the table between them. Not a card this time. A printout, slightly worn at the creases as if it had been folded and unfolded multiple times. She looked at it before picking it up, a habit of caution, and then opened it. It was a military incident review form. The date at the top was 14 months ago. The subject line read, Coastal View Medical Center Referral Program Irregular Protocol Review. Her name was on the form, not as a victim, as a witness. Someone had been looking for her for 14 months. The Naval Inspector General's office opened a quiet review of Vale's research grant after a veteran's family filed a complaint, Marcus said. The veteran had been transferred to Coastal View. He died during what was documented as a routine neuromodulation therapy session. He paused. The session wasn't routine, and it wasn't documented until after his family hired an attorney. Who sent you? She said. I was asked to locate you, he said. Not by the Navy, by the veteran's name on that form. He tapped the document. His brother, who happens to be active JAG. She looked at the form again. The veteran's name was Sergeant Dale Pirro. She didn't know the name, but the date of his transfer to Coastal View was 4 days before her collapse in the supply corridor, and when she looked at the referring physician on his intake form, she felt something cold move through her chest. The referring physician was Callum Vale. You need to see what I have, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, said Marcus. And you need to know something first. He leaned forward slightly. Those 3 men who just walked out of here? They're not hospital security. They're not law enforcement. They work for a private contractor firm that Vale has been using to manage what he calls data continuity for his research program. He let that settle. They've been inside your apartment twice in the last 6 weeks. The room didn't spin. She'd expected something like this. She'd built the false panel specifically because she'd expected something like this. But hearing it confirmed in the middle of the hospital cafeteria, where she'd once moved fast and mattered, made the cold in her chest spread outward. They didn't find it, she said. I know, he said. Because you're not in custody, and Vale is still monitoring instead of moving. He looked at her steadily. But he's done waiting. Those 3 men weren't here to talk. Atlas shifted. He moved from beside her wheelchair to behind it, positioning himself at her back. She noticed. She understood what it meant. She looked at the cafeteria around her, the coffee machine, the nurses on break, the afternoon light moving across the linoleum, and thought about the 2 years she'd spent in this building, first as someone who mattered, then as someone to be managed, and now, apparently, as the one thread a careful and powerful man needed to pull before everything he'd built could unravel. Her hand was steady when she reached for her phone. I need to go home, she said now. I know, said Marcus. I have a car outside. He stood, gathered the document, and looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided something. And I'm coming with you. Atlas stood up. She looked at the dog at the particular quality of his attention, still directed toward the door where the 3 men had left, still reading something in the air that she couldn't fully interpret but had learned, in the past hour, to trust. How long have you been watching this situation? She said. Long enough, said Marcus, to know those men are going to come back. And next time they won't knock. She didn't answer. She pushed her chair toward the exit, and he walked beside her, and the dog moved ahead of them both, and the cafeteria crowd parted without quite knowing why. Outside, in the parking lot, her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time it was not a text. It was a photograph taken from above, through what looked like a drone or a high window of her apartment building. And circled in the image, in red, was her window. Beneath it, the caption read, "We found the second drive. Come in quietly, or we show the board what's on it." Stared at the image for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to Marcus, who was already reading it over her shoulder, and said, "They didn't find the drive. They're bluffing." "Yes," he said. "But they have enough to make the threat credible," she said. "Means they found something." "Yes," he said again. "My PT record," she said. It came to her fully formed, the way realizations do when they've been waiting to be named. He altered my records. That's what they found, or rather, that's what they control. The documentation that says my condition is neurological and progressive, not induced. If he releases it with the right framing, you look like you invented the injury to destroy him, Marcus finished. He wasn't alarmed. His voice was the same even register it had been, since he sat down across from her. Which means we need the drive before he finishes building the counter-narrative. Atlas stopped walking. He turned his head toward the far end of the parking lot, and the fur along his spine rose in a single silent wave. The end of the row, an SUV with tinted windows, had its engine running. It had not been there when they'd walked in. Marcus didn't stop walking. He changed direction, a slight, economical pivot that shifted their path away from the row where the SUV was idling, angling them toward the visitor structure on the north side of the lot, moving with the casual pace of two people deciding where to have lunch. Anyone watching from a distance would not have seen urgency. Anyone watching closely would have noticed that Atlas was no longer behind them. He was ahead, moving in a wide arc around the perimeter of the parked cars, with the low ground-covering trot of an animal running a search pattern. "Don't look at it," Marcus said, his voice quiet and level, the kind of instruction that required no explanation if you understood the situation, and no repetition if you didn't. Nora didn't look. She pushed her chair at the same pace she always used, which was slightly faster than most people expected, and kept her eyes forward. Her heart was doing something unpleasant and rapid inside her chest, but her hands on the wheels were steady, and she'd learned over the past 22 months that the distance between feeling afraid and appearing afraid was a gap she could hold open through deliberate effort. "Plates," she said, "rental, and enterprise sticker on the bumper." He didn't slow down, which means they booked it in the last 24 hours, or they rotate vehicles. Either way, those plates are dead ends. "How many people?" "Driver, passenger, possibly a third in the back. Windows are too dark." He glanced left, reading the structure entrance. "There's a service elevator in the north tower. Takes us to the sky bridge on the 3rd floor, back into the hospital." "I know the building," she said. They reached the structure entrance without incident. The elevator was slow, the kind of institutional slow that seems designed to test patience, and they rode it in silence. Atlas appeared in the gap, just as the doors began to close, sliding through without breaking stride, and positioned himself between them and the control panel with the same automatic logic he'd used all afternoon. Skybridge was empty. She let out a breath. "This is not going to stop at the cafeteria," she said. "No. Those men this morning, the 3 who came in, that was a message. They wanted me to know they weren't afraid of being seen." He wasn't arguing. He was listening, which was different. "Vale is moving the timeline," she said. Something changed. Something accelerated this. She thought about the photograph of her apartment, the circled window, the caption that had been worded with the particular precision of a legal threat rather than a violent one. "He's not trying to scare me into silence. He already knows I haven't talked. Preparing something documentation, a counterfiling, something he can use to discredit me before I can act." "The altered medical records," Marcus said. "Yes, but it's more than that." She stopped her chair in the middle of the sky bridge and looked at the window that ran along its length, the flat, functional view of the parking structure, and, beyond it, the sun on Pensacola Bay. "He has access to my physical therapy records, my neurological assessments, every clinical note from the past 22 months. If he's altered the documentation, showing how I lost function, he could make a compelling case that I've been building a grievance with fabricated evidence, that I manufactured the injury or exaggerated it." She paused. "The board would have to take that seriously, and once they're investigating me, anything I produce about his research program looks like retaliation." Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds. "Then we need to get ahead of it." "The drive," she said. "The drive," he confirmed. "And we need to move tonight, before he finishes whatever he's filing." She turned her chair from the window and looked at him. In the flat light of the sky bridge, he looked older than he had in the cafeteria, not in a diminished way, but in the way that certain faces carry their history in plain sight rather than concealing it. She'd spent 2 years learning to read the faces of people who had decided whether she was worth helping, and she'd gotten accurate enough at it that she trusted her read now. He wasn't performing concern. He was concerned. There was a difference, and she'd learned it the hard way. "The JAG attorney," she said. "Piro's brother. Can he move quickly?" "He's already moving," Marcus said. The review was quiet because they didn't have documented evidence from inside the program. They had a complaint, a death that didn't add up, and circumstantial links. "What you photographed 22 months ago, if it's what I think it is, changes the weight of everything they have." "You don't know what I photographed," she said. "No," he agreed. "Tell me." She considered him for a moment. "Then protocol documentation for a neuromodulation study. 3 pages. Patient consent forms that had been altered after the fact, I could tell, because the signature dates didn't match the admission timestamps in the chart. A list of coded subject identifiers cross-referenced with what looked like military unit designations." She kept her voice flat and clinical, the way she'd trained herself to recount it, because if she let the other register in the shock she'd felt when she first understood what she was holding, it became harder to be useful. and a single internal memo from Vale to someone identified only as a contractor contact, describing the study's goal, as in these were his exact words, optimizing compliance threshold response under targeted neurological intervention in high-resistance subject populations. The silence that followed was the kind that fills up from the inside. High-resistance subject populations, Marcus said. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries, she said, who were already compromised, already in the system, already unlikely to question a treatment protocol prescribed by a credentialed physician with federal grant backing. She looked at Atlas, who had settled on the skybridge floor and was watching her with the same attentive stillness he'd maintained all day. He was testing something on them. I don't know the full scope. I photographed what I could reach before the shift supervisor called me back to the floor. And 4 days later, Marcus said, and 4 days later I was on the floor of the supply corridor with partial paralysis in both legs and no explanation that held up to scrutiny, she said. The attending who documented my collapse was Vale. Marcus looked at her without speaking. She held the look. I need you to understand something, she said. I've been carrying this for 22 months. I've tried 3 times to get someone to listen. The first time, the hospital's compliance office told me my concerns would be reviewed and then never contacted me again. The second time, I went to the state medical board and was told that without current clinical access or some documented evidence submitted through proper channels, they couldn't open a formal investigation. The third time, I found an attorney who took my case for 6 weeks and then withdrew because he received a letter from Vale's legal team that, he said, made continuation professionally untenable. She paused. So when I say I need this to work, I need you to understand what I mean. This isn't a preference. I've run out of other paths. I know, he said, that's why I'm here. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of operational fact, and the distinction mattered to her more than any amount of comfort would have. They went back through the hospital to her car, a hand-control sedan she'd learned to drive 14 months ago, after 2 months of refusing to admit she needed to. Marcus followed in his own vehicle. Atlas rode with Marcus, pressed against the passenger window, with the particular alert posture of an animal that knows it's still on duty, even if the immediate threat has withdrawn. The drive to her apartment took 11 minutes. She spent the first 5 watching her mirrors and the last 6 thinking about the false panel in the second bedroom closet, the one she'd built herself over 3 weekends, measuring the space, cutting the board, painting the edge to match the wall texture. Because she'd understood even then that what she had was the kind of thing that needed to be hidden, and that hiding it well was the most important thing she could do with the time she had. They had been inside her apartment, twice, apparently, and they hadn't found it. She let herself feel something about that, not pride exactly, more the grim, specific satisfaction of a person who expected the worst and prepared for it accurately. Apartment building was a 4-story complex 3 blocks from the bay. She had chosen it for the ground floor unit, the accessible parking, and the fact that the building management company was large and impersonal enough that no one tracked her movements with interest. She pushed through the lobby, Marcus behind her, Atlas moving on his leash in the alert, nose-low trot that meant he was reading the space. Stopped at her door. Not dramatically. He just stopped, sat, and looked at the door handle with the fixed, specific attention that had preceded every meaningful development of the afternoon. Nora stopped her chair. Marcus pulled her gently back from the doorway with a touch on her shoulder, light, brief, asking rather than directing, and crouched beside Atlas. He looked at the door frame in the methodical way of someone who knows what to look for and is checking for it. After a moment he stood. The seal on the lock is broken, he said. Recent. The scratch pattern on the cylinder is fresh. They came back, she said, yes. She didn't move. She thought through it, the layout of the apartment, the second bedroom, the closet, the panel, the drive behind it. They'd been inside a 3rd time and had been more thorough. We go in, she said. I need to know if it's still there. If someone's still inside, Atlas will know before we open the door, she said. Marcus looked at the dog. Atlas was alert, reading the air through the gap at the bottom of the door, but his posture hadn't shifted to the braced, so-set position he'd taken in the cafeteria when the men came in. Attentive. He wasn't preparing to engage. Clear, Marcus said. He went in first. She followed. The apartment was in the specific kind of disarray that says professional search things replaced, almost correctly. Drawers closed with a millimeter gap that hadn't been there before. The couch slightly off its marks on the carpet. Not ransacked. Methodically examined and reassembled with the assumption that the subject wouldn't notice. She noticed. She went directly to the second bedroom, without stopping in the kitchen or living area. Closet door was closed, which was correct. The shelf arrangement inside looked undisturbed, which was almost correct. She reached past the winter coats. She hadn't needed winter coats in Florida, but had kept them specifically because they created visual depth, and pressed her fingers against the back panel. The edge was intact. The seam she'd painted was untouched. Exhaled. She pulled the panel free. It came out in 2 sections, the way she'd built it, and reached into the space behind it. The drive was a waterproof USB case, matte black, roughly the size of a tube of lip balm. She held it in her palm for a moment before she turned back to Marcus. "Still here," she said. He stood in the closet doorway with his arms crossed, and she could see the thing he was deciding not to say, which was probably something about how close that had been, and she was grateful he didn't say it. "We can't stay here," she said. "Not tonight." "No." "Do you have a secure location?" "Yes." He glanced around the room, the disrupted closet, the signs of intrusion, the ordinary private space of her life that had been walked through by people who saw it as a problem to be managed. "What you need?" 10 minutes. She was done in 7. They drove to a Navy Lodge facility near the base. Marcus had a reservation under a name she didn't recognize, which she understood not to be an accident, and by 8 in the evening they were in a room with 1 table, a laptop Marcus produced from a case in his trunk, and a secure hotspot connection that he explained briefly had been arranged through the JAG office before he'd ever walked into the Coastal View cafeteria that morning. "Planned to find me today," she said. "I planned to make contact today," he said. "Finding you wasn't difficult. You're at the same table every Tuesday." She almost said something sharp about that, and then didn't, because being predictable had been a survival mechanism. If she deviated from routine, her PT sessions suffered, her independence suffered, and she needed both, and she wasn't going to apologize for the conditions that had shaped her choices. Plug the drive into the laptop. The files loaded slowly. She had encrypted the contents with a program she'd downloaded herself. Following documentation, she'd printed and memorized and then destroyed. Marcus sat across the table and waited without asking questions, which she appreciated more than she could cleanly articulate. The 3 photographs opened first. She had taken them with her personal phone camera, slightly angled because she'd been holding the chart in one hand and the phone in the other, standing in a ward corridor at 2 in the morning with the specific alertness of a person who knows they are doing something they cannot undo. The images were clear enough. The protocol headers were readable. Consent form alterations were visible if you knew where to look, and she had marked the relevant sections with digital annotations she'd added the following morning before she understood how quickly things would move against her. Marcus leaned forward. He looked at the images for a long time without speaking. She watched him read the actual reading posture of someone processing content rather than performing engagement, and when he finally sat back, his expression had shifted. "The memo," he said. "The contractor contact." "Yes." "The identifier is a 7-digit code. Do you know what it corresponds to?" "No," she said. "I assumed it was an internal grant reference." "It's not." He reached across and typed something in the search field she'd left open on the laptop, not into the files, but into a secure document he opened from his own account. He found what he was looking for and turned the screen toward her. "It's a DoD contractor registration number. The company it belongs to was dissolved 14 months ago, 2 weeks after the Inspector General's office made its first quiet inquiry." She looked at the number, then at the dissolved company name, Arcturus Neurosolutions, LLC. "They shut it down," she said, when the IG started looking. "They shut down the company," Marcus said. "That doesn't mean they stopped the work." He leaned back. "This memo connects Vail directly to a DoD-registered contractor running a parallel research program. It's not a hospital compliance issue. That's federal." She sat with that for a moment. Federal was the word she'd needed for 22 months. She'd known it was the right word, knowing it hadn't helped her until now. "Piero's brother," she said. "He needs to see this tonight." "He's waiting," Marcus said. He produced his phone, and she saw that he already had a message thread open. "Told him we'd have something before midnight." She started to respond, and her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The unknown number again. She had been expecting it. The text this time was longer. "You made a mistake coming home. We have the building covered. You have until 600 to surrender the evidence voluntarily, or we file the board complaint at opening of business. Once that happens, we cannot control what the press receives. Make the right choice, Nora. This doesn't have to end your life twice." She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table with a deliberate, quiet motion and looked at Marcus. "Filing at 6 a.m., she said. "Yes. Which means She glanced at the clock on the laptop. "Approximately 9 hours. 9 hours, he agreed. "Is that enough?" He was quiet for a moment, the honest quiet of someone calculating rather than reassuring. Depends on what Piero can get moving tonight, he said finally, and whether the IG office has a duty officer who's willing to receive evidence outside of business hours. He picked up his phone. Give me 20 minutes. She watched him stand and move to the far side of the room, speaking in the low, specific cadence of a man conducting professional business, thought about Vale's text and the phrase "end your life" twice, and the particular contempt it contained for what her life had become since the night in the corridor, the careful, constrained, diminished version of living she'd built out of the wreckage of the career and the body she'd had before. She thought about Sergeant Dale Piero, whose name she hadn't known until 3 hours ago, and who had died during a routine session that wasn't routine, in a hospital where a respected physician had decided that certain patients were suitable materials for experimentation rather than people who warranted protection. She thought about the 17 other subject identifiers on the protocol list in her photographs, each one a code that corresponded to a human being who had survived combat and trauma and been transferred to Coastal View for care and had instead become a data point. She turned the drive over in her fingers. Marcus came back to the table. Piero has a contact at the IG duty office, he said. They'll receive a secure file submission tonight and flag it for immediate senior review. That creates a documented timestamp federal receipt before Vale's board complaint goes in. He sat. Doesn't stop him filing. But it means that whatever he files lands in a context where federal investigators have already seen the underlying evidence. The board will know it's a counterfiling. That changes how they treat it. Doesn't guarantee anything, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She appreciated that. She had spent 22 months being given guarantees by people who didn't have the standing to make them, and the honest absence of one was steadier ground. She turned back to the laptop and began preparing the submission file, organizing the photographs, the annotations, the encrypted memo, the timeline she'd written in the 3rd month after her collapse, when she'd still been able to pretend she was preparing for an investigation, rather than simply not wanting to forget. Marcus sat across the table and reviewed the documents she handed him, flagging clinical terminology that would need plain language summaries for non-medical reviewers, noting the points where chain of custody documentation would matter. They worked through 11 o'clock, through midnight. At 12:40, Marcus submitted the file. She sat back and looked at the confirmation screen, a 12-digit reference number, a timestamp, apartment seal, and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has been tightly wound for a very long time and has just done something that cannot be undone. That's it, she said. That's the first part, he said. She looked at him. Vale still controls the hospital, he said. His board complaint still goes in at 6. The IG review takes time even in emergency protocol weeks, not days. During that time, he can make things difficult. He kept his voice even. And those contractors outside your building, they're not going to stand down because we filed a document. I know, she said. Her phone lit up. Not a text this time. Call from a number she didn't recognize, with a Virginia area code. She looked at Marcus. Answer it, he said. She did. The voice on the other end was a woman, precise, professionally level, with the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to conveying information quickly and accurately. Ms. Voss. This is Commander Althea Sims, Naval Inspector General's office. I've reviewed the file submitted on your behalf tonight. 2 questions, and I need you to answer them directly. No preamble, no courtesy warm-up. First, are you currently in a secure location? Yes, Nora said. Second, the memo you documented, the contractor identifier, do you have any additional material from inside Coastal View's neurology archive that references that program? Anything beyond what was submitted tonight? Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about the ward she'd worked in, the filing system she'd known better than the physicians who signed off on it, the archive access she'd had as senior trauma nurse that had never been formally revoked, even after she was removed from active duty, because no one had thought to revoke it, because the people who removed her had assumed she wouldn't have the access codes anymore, and she had never corrected that assumption. Yes, she said. A brief pause on the other end. Voss, Commander Sims said, I need you at Coastal View Medical Center tomorrow morning. Not through the front entrance. There is a federal access protocol I'm activating at 700. You'll receive a text from this number with instructions. Another pause shorter. I'm also sending a protective detail to your current location tonight. Do not leave before they arrive. How did you know where I? Mr. Hale checked in with our office when he arrived in Pensacola, Sims said. He was instructed to keep us current. A beat. He has. Nora looked at Marcus across the table. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had in the cafeteria when she'd asked why he was still there, not guilty, not evasive, carrying the particular weight of someone who has been honest in the ways they could be and is prepared to explain the ways they couldn't. She held the phone for a moment before she responded to Sims. "The archive," she said. "What's in there? It's more than what I photographed. I saw enough to know that. The protocol I found was a summary document. The full trial records would be in the neurology archive under a research subfolder that Vale kept separately from the standard clinical files." She paused. "I knew the filing structure. I knew the access path. Couldn't get back in." "Can you get in tomorrow?" Sims asked. "My access was never formally revoked," she said. A different kind of quiet on the line. 7 a.m., Sims said. "Don't be late." The call ended. Nora set the phone on the table and looked at the drive in her hand. The drive she'd hidden and protected for 22 months, the thing she'd built a false wall for, the thing she'd carried like a weight she was afraid to put down, because putting it down meant accepting she might never find the right place to set it. She looked at Marcus. "You've been in contact with Sims this whole time," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact she was placing on the table. "Since I arrived in Pensacola 4 days ago," he said. "I'm not a civilian contractor, Nora. I'm attached to a joint federal task force reviewing DoD research compliance. Piro's case was the entry point." He kept his eyes on her. "I sat down in that cafeteria because I needed to make contact in a way that didn't put you in immediate danger. Couldn't approach you in the parking structure. I couldn't come to your apartment. The watchers would have moved the moment they saw federal contact." "So you brought Atlas," she said. "He asked to come," Marcus said. "I'm serious. He heard me packing the car and sat in front of the door and wouldn't move." A brief pause. "He does that sometimes." She looked at the dog, who was stretched out under the table, with his chin on his front paws, watching the room with the lidded, resting vigilance of an animal whose body has relaxed, but whose attention hasn't fully powered down. She almost said something, decided against it. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "The archive." "Tomorrow morning," he confirmed. She nodded. She looked at the confirmation number on the laptop screen, 12 digits, that represented the first clean action she'd taken in 22 months, that felt like it might actually reach the right place, and was aware of something moving in her chest that she was careful not to name too quickly, because she'd done that before, and the collapse afterward was a particular kind of damage. She was still thinking when a knock came at the door. 3 distinct raps spaced. Marcus looked up, and something in his posture shifted fractionally, barely visible, and then he crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. When he turned back, his expression had changed. "It's not the detail," he said. "It's early for them by 2 hours." He kept his voice low. "There are 2 of them. One of them is in a Coastal View employee lanyard." Atlas was already off the floor. He moved to the door and pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom, reading what came through, and then he turned his head back toward Nora with an expression that told her everything she needed to know before Marcus said the word. "Armed," Marcus said. She reached for her phone to call Sims back and found that the call wouldn't connect. The signal was gone. The signal didn't come back. Nora looked at the phone in her hand, 2 bars dropping to 1, then to nothing. Kind of deliberate dead zone that doesn't happen by accident in a building with full commercial coverage, and understood that whoever was at the door had come prepared. Signal jamming was not a tool that civilians carried. It was not something that private hospital contractors deployed on routine surveillance. Whatever Vale had activated tonight, it was not the careful, patient monitoring operation she'd been living under for 22 months. This was something that had been waiting in reserve, and it had just come out. "Bathroom window," Marcus said. "Already moving." "What size?" "Standard." "I can't—" She stopped herself. She'd been about to say she couldn't get through a bathroom window in a wheelchair, and then she registered that he already knew that, and the question meant something else. 18 by 24 inches. It opens outward. Single latch.
Ground floor, yes.
Drops to a maintenance path. Concrete. He looked at the door. The knocking had stopped, which was worse than if it had continued. Atlas was pressed against the wall beside the door frame, below the line of sight of any peephole from the outside, his body low and absolutely still. "I'm not leaving through a window," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." He crouched beside his bag and unzipped the outer pocket, and she saw what was inside. A compact 2-way radio, the kind used for close-range secure communication, already set to a frequency. Turned it on. Static, then a voice broken, partially jammed, but present. "Hail. Respond. We are 4 minutes out, details close," he said. "They're fighting the jamming." He clipped the radio to his belt and stood. 4 minutes, they'll be through the door in 2, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said what 4 minus 2 equaled. "Can he get through the lock?" she asked. They already know the room number. They jammed the signal. They have someone in hospital credentials. They have a keycard duplicator or a master. Yes, they get through the lock whenever they decide to. Then why knock? It was the right question. He understood that she'd already answered it herself. They want me to open it, she said. They want it voluntary. They're still trying to do this without a scene. Which means they're not authorized to force it, he said. Not yet. There's still something they need from you that force doesn't get them. The drive. It was the only answer. The submission to the IG was time-stamped, but the actual evidence was the photographs, and Vale knew that an encrypted file sent at midnight by a federal task force contact carried more weight if the originating evidence could be challenged. If he could get the drive and demonstrate it had been tampered with, or that the chain of custody was broken, or simply that she'd handed it over under duress to an operative whose credentials he could dispute, he needed her to give it to him, or to appear to. She looked at the drive in her hand. He doesn't know what we submitted, she said. He knows we went home. He knows we left. He knows we're here, but he doesn't know what the IG file contained because the submission was encrypted end to end. He doesn't know if we submitted the photographs or a summary or nothing at all. She turned the drive over. He still thinks this is the only copy of the evidence. Marcus was watching her. It is, she said. Except that it's not, because the IG has the photographs now, but he doesn't know that. She looked up. So if we let them take the drive, we give him a reason to stand down, Marcus said. We give him a reason to believe he's won, she said, which is not the same thing. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. She ejected the drive from the laptop, held it in her palm, and looked around the room. Her gaze settled on the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling above the desk, the standard, slightly yellowed kind installed in every Navy lodge room, mounted with 2 screws at the base. She looked at Marcus. He understood immediately, crossed to the desk, stood on the chair, and in 40 seconds had the cover off, the battery compartment open, and the drive tucked into the space beside the 9-volt. He remounted the cover and stepped down. It wasn't invisible, but it wasn't obvious, and obvious was what they needed to avoid. She pulled a blank USB drive from her bag. She carried 3 as a habit from before that she'd maintained without fully knowing why, and plugged it into the laptop. Created a folder, named it with a clinical-sounding string of letters and numbers, and dragged 3 irrelevant files into it: a grocery list, a physical therapy exercise guide she'd downloaded 6 months ago, a scanned copy of an old utility bill. Then she ejected it and held it in her palm. A different knock this time. Slower. The knock of a person who has made a decision. Open the door, she said. Nora, open it, she said. Let me handle this. He read her for 1 second. Then he went to the door and opened it. There were 2 men. The one in front was wearing a Coastal View lanyard over a dark jacket 40s, thick across the shoulders, with the flat affect of a man doing a job rather than making a choice. The one behind him was younger, holding a phone rather than a weapon, which meant the weapon was elsewhere, and she didn't look for it, because looking for it would tell them she was afraid. And she was afraid, but they didn't need that information. Ms. Voss, the first man said. His voice was controlled, professional. We're here to collect the evidence material you've been holding. Dr. Vale is prepared to drop the board complaint entirely in exchange for your voluntary cooperation tonight. She looked at him from her wheelchair, and she made a deliberate choice about the expression she used. Not defiant, not frightened, not negotiating. She went with the face she'd spent 22 months perfecting, the one she used when administrators explained to her, patiently and incorrectly, why the things she'd reported couldn't have happened the way she remembered. The face that said, I understand everything you're saying, and I am less moved by it than you expected. You'll drop the board complaint, she said, voluntarily. Tonight, in writing if you want it, and in exchange I give you whatever you removed from the ward that night, the copies you made. He was good. He said it neutrally, like an item on a checklist. All copies. She held up the blank drive. This is what I have, she said. He looked at it. His partner took a step forward. Atlas moved from beside the wall to between the partner and the bed, with a single, fluid step, no growl, no display, just presence, positioned with the precise geometry of an animal that has calculated how much space it needs to make a point without making contact. Partner stopped. The first man reached for the drive, placed it in his palm. He looked at it. The way he looked at it told her something: the slight narrowing, the check of its weight, and she understood that he was not entirely certain it was real, which meant Vale had briefed him on the possibility of a decoy, which meant Vale was smarter than she'd hoped, but not smarter than she'd prepared for. You're making the right choice, the man said. His voice had a quality that was meant to sound like reassurance and landed like the verbal equivalent of a door being closed. "I know," she said. They left. Marcus closed the door and stood with his back against it for a moment. Atlas walked back to Nora and sat beside her chair. Outside, the signal came back 1 bar, 2 bars, full strength, and Marcus's radio crackled with the detail's voice, announcing they were 30 seconds out and asking for status. Picked up the radio. "Standby. Situation is temporarily stable. I need a hard perimeter on the building. Do not engage anyone leaving. Get plates, get faces, let them go." Pause. Copy. He looked at her. She was looking at the smoke detector. "We have until he looks at what's on that drive," she said. "How long?" "He won't wait long. An hour, maybe less." She looked at the clock. 1:17 a.m. "The archive access I have, it's a login credential. A system password I memorized because I used it daily. If Vale's team hasn't specifically gone into the hospital's network management system and removed my account, I can still get in remotely. Can you do it from here?" "Not securely. The IG's submission used Sims's secure channel. If I log into the hospital network from a personal connection, Vale's IT team will see it." "But from inside the building?" "From inside the building on a hardwired terminal in a ward I used to work, logged in as a current user, it would look like a standard after-hours access. They flag remote anomalies. They don't flag internal ones, especially if the account hasn't been formally revoked." She paused. "It's a flaw in their system I noticed a long time ago and never reported, because I didn't think I'd ever need it." "You're going to the hospital tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "We have a window before Vale realizes what we gave him. After that, he moves on the archive directly." She looked at him. "Can the detail cover us?" 2 agents. Yes, he was already on the radio. They moved at 1:34 a.m. The detail was 2 people in a government-plated sedan. A woman named Reyes, who drove and said almost nothing, and a man named Thibault, who rode in the back with Marcus and spent the drive coordinating with Sims's office on a line that was now fully secured. Atlas rode in the cargo area with his chin on the back seat, watching the road behind them. The approach to Coastal View at that hour was different from the daytime geometry. Nora knew the parking lots thinned out, the main entrance lights on reduced power, the emergency bay the only fully lit perimeter. Reyes took them around to the service entrance on the east side, a utilitarian door used by maintenance and overnight supply deliveries, mounted with a keypad and a badge reader. Nora looked at it. She had not been inside this building after hours in 22 months. She had sat in the cafeteria. She had moved through the lobby for PT appointments. She had not been in the wards where she used to work, had not stood in the corridors where she'd been fast and certain and capable, had not gone back to the neurology wing where she'd collapsed, and where the floor had been cold, and the lights had been very bright when she'd opened her eyes. Pushed herself toward the keypad. Her hands were not entirely steady. She made them steady enough. The badge code was a 6-digit sequence she'd never written down. She'd memorized it the day it was assigned, and had kept it the way she kept everything important now. In the part of her mind she'd trained to hold what she couldn't afford to lose. Entered it. The reader beeped. The door opened. Inside, the hospital at 1:47 a.m. smelled exactly the same as it had at 11:45 on a Tuesday afternoon, and the familiarity of it landed somewhere below her sternum and stayed there. Thibault moved ahead. Reyes took the rear. Marcus walked beside her without being asked. The neurology ward was on the 3rd floor. They took the service elevator, the same slow institutional elevator she'd used with Marcus earlier in the day, which now felt like a different era, and emerged into a corridor that was dim and quiet, running with only the overhead fluorescence on reduced night mode power. A nursing station was visible at the far end, occupied by a single staff member who had her head bent over a workstation screen and did not look up. The archive access terminal was inside a records room 14 feet past the nursing station. "If she sees us," Marcus said quietly. "I know her," Nora said. "She was a junior staff nurse my last year here." She looked at the bent head at the station. "Let me go first." She pushed herself down the corridor. "The nursing station," she said the woman's name, Becca. The nurse looked up. Her face went through several transitions in rapid sequence: surprise, recognition, confusion, and then something that, on another night, might have opened into a conversation Nora didn't have time for. "I need 2 minutes in the archive room," Nora said, keeping her voice low and even and clinical. "Federal Review. I'm with a federal team." She said it the way she used to deliver difficult diagnoses, clearly, without apology, with the tone that said this is information and not a negotiation. "You don't need to do anything. I just need you to not call administration until I'm out." Becca looked at her, looked past her at Marcus and the 2 agents, looked at Atlas. 2 minutes, she said. The archive room was unlocked. It operated on badge access, not key, and the door's badge code still worked. She went directly to the hardwired terminal at the back of the room, logged in with her credentials, and waited through the 7 seconds of loading that felt like considerably more. Count was active. She exhaled, moved through the folder structure with the automated ease of muscle memory, the neurology subdirectory, the research subfolder, the nested hierarchy that Vale had structured to look like standard clinical organization, and that she had only understood the full shape of because she'd spent 2 years as the nurse who filed things into it and found what she was looking for. Not 3 pages, not a summary document. The full trial archive, 462 files, spanning 31 months, containing patient records, session logs, neuromodulation calibration data, outcome assessments, adverse event reports, and, in a folder labeled simply C Internal, a complete correspondence archive between Vale and the Arcturus contractor contact. Plugged a drive, the real one, retrieved from the smoke detector 20 minutes earlier, while Marcus covered the door into the terminal and began the transfer. The files were large. The progress bar moved at a speed that made her jaw tight. Marcus stood at the door. How long? 14 minutes at this rate. We don't have 14 minutes. I know, she said. 8 sets in, the nursing station phone rang. She heard Becca answer it, heard the register of the voice change, heard the specific inflection of a person being asked a direct question they didn't want to answer. Move faster, Marcus said. It doesn't move faster, she said. That's not how file transfers work. He didn't argue. He stepped out to the corridor and said something quietly to Thibault, and she heard Thibault's radio briefly. 11 minutes, 13. The correspondence folder was the last to transfer. She watched the individual files populate and counted them. 48 emails, 11 internal memos, and 1 file that was not formatted like a document. It was a video file, labeled with a date 14 months ago and a subject identifier she recognized from the protocol list in her original photographs. She didn't have time to open it. 14 minutes and 30 seconds. Transfer complete. She ejected the drive, closed the session, and was out of the chair roll before the terminal had finished its logout sequence. Thibault met them at the elevator. We have a problem. Define problem, Marcus said. Vale is in the building. Security just badged him in through the main entrance. He looked at Nora. He's heading up. The elevator was too slow. Nora looked at the stairwell door 6 feet to her left and made a calculation that she'd been making for 22 months. What she could do, what she couldn't, and which category this fell into. Go, she said to Marcus. Take the drive, secure channel to Sims right now. I'm not leaving. I can't do the stairs, and we both know it. The elevator is slower than he is. She held out the drive. Take it. I'll meet Becca at the nursing station. Vale isn't going to touch me in front of a staff witness. Half second. He took the drive. He and Thibault went through the stairwell door. Reyes stayed. Nora pushed back to the nursing station. Becca looked at her with the expression of someone who has just understood that what they agreed to was more complicated than advertised. I'm sorry, Nora said. I didn't have another way. It's fine, Becca said, in the tone that meant it was not entirely fine, but that she had made a decision. Sit here. Act normal. Nora positioned herself beside the station, picked up a patient chart from the return tray, and looked at it as if she were reading it, and 3 minutes later the elevator opened at the far end of the corridor, and Callum Vale stepped out. She had not seen him in person since the morning she'd been discharged from her own involuntary admission, the admission that had been documented as a voluntary neurological workup, and that she had signed papers for, while still unclear-headed from whatever had been administered to her the night before. She had a clear memory of his face above her hospital bed, composed, authoritative, carrying the particular benign certainty of a man who has not been seriously questioned in a long time. He looked older. She noticed it with the clinical detachment of someone who has thought about a person so much that the actual version is inevitably less than the imagined one. Stop 10 feet away. Nora, he said. He used her first name the way powerful people use first names as a reminder of asymmetry rather than a gesture of familiarity. Dr. Vale, she said. His gaze moved over her, over the chart in her hands, over Becca at the station. You're going to give me what you took from this archive tonight. I didn't take anything, she said. I accessed records I have legitimate credentials to access. My account was never revoked. Your account will be revoked in...
He checked his phone. Approximately 4 minutes.
Fine, she said. I was already finished. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, he was too controlled for alarm, but a recalibration. The same kind she'd seen in the man who'd taken the blank drive. You're bluffing. You gave a blank drive to 2 men tonight, she said. I'm curious how that felt when you realized it. A pause. "Whatever you've sent to whoever you think is listening," he said, his voice dropping to a register that was meant to be private, but that Becca could clearly hear. "It won't matter. I have 17 years of documented research, federal backing, peer-reviewed publication, and the full support of this hospital's board. You are a former employee with a documented progressive neurological condition and a history of making unsubstantiated allegations. The IG has received anonymous complaints about this program before. They went nowhere. They went nowhere because they didn't have documentation," she said. "They have it now. What you photographed 22 months ago is not what I sent tonight," she said. He stared at her. "The full archive, Dr. Vale," she said. 31 months. 462 files." She kept her voice exactly level. "Including the correspondence with Arcturus Neuro Solutions. Including the adverse event reports you didn't file with the IRB. Including the video file from 14 months ago with the subject identifier from your calibration protocol." She paused. "I haven't watched it yet, but Commander Sims has people who are watching it right now." The corridor was very quiet. Vale's composure did not break. That was the thing about him, it didn't break. It bent, and the bending was almost worse, because it meant he was already adapting, already calculating, already looking for the angle that remained available to him. "You don't know what's in that file," he said. "No," she said. "But you do. And you're standing in this corridor at 2 in the morning, which tells me you know exactly what it means that someone else is going to see it." He took a step toward her. Reyes moved from the wall. "Federal agent," Reyes said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Vale stopped. He looked at Reyes. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes for the first time in 22 months, for the first time since she'd been lying on a hospital floor, looking up at his face, she saw something that was not authority and was not certainty. It was the specific, unguarded expression of a man who has just understood that he miscalculated. He turned and walked back toward the elevator without speaking. She watched him go. She held the patient chart until the elevator doors closed, and then she set it down on the desk, and her hands were shaking not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular physical aftermath of sustained controlled stillness, tremor that comes when a body finally releases what it's been holding. Becca put a hand on her shoulder briefly, said nothing, removed it. Nora looked at the empty corridor where Vale had been standing. Her phone signal came back. "A text from Marcus 1 floor up via stairwell. Sims has the drive. She's watching the video file now. Stay where you are." She typed back, "Vale is in the building. He knows. 3 seconds, then I know. Sims knows. There are federal agents at the main entrance." She set the phone in her lap. She looked at the fluorescent corridor, the nursing station, the door to the archive room still slightly ajar. She had been in this building as a patient, as a supplicant, as a problem to be managed. She had not been here as herself, as the person who knew this floor better than anyone currently staffing it, who had memorized its filing structure and its access codes and its flaws, because that had been her job, and she had been good at her job. She had just used every piece of that knowledge in the span of 22 minutes. Her phone buzzed. Not Marcus this time. Commander Sims directly. "The video file, we need you to confirm subject identity. It's not a patient. We're sending the still to your phone now." The image loaded slowly on her screen, frame by frame, the hospital connection rebuilding itself after the jamming. When it finished loading, she looked at it for a long time. It was a session room. She recognized the same neuromodulation suite she'd passed 100 times on her rounds. In the chair was a man in a hospital gown, with sensor leads attached to his temples and the base of his skull, his eyes open and fixed on a screen she couldn't see in the frame. He was young, mid-20s, maybe with the particular physical build of someone whose body had been maintained by military training and then interrupted by injury. His face was slack in a way that was not sleep and was not sedation, and was not any voluntary state. Standing beside the chair holding a tablet and making notes with the calm efficiency of a man performing a routine task, was Callum Vale. And beside Vale, partially cut off by the frame's edge but unmistakably present, was a second man in uniform, with insignia she could partially read. Looking at the screen the patient was fixed on with an expression of clinical interest. She didn't recognize the patient. She recognized the second man. She had seen his face in the photograph Marcus had placed on the cafeteria table that morning, the incident review form, the JAG contact, the person who had sent Marcus to find her. Lieutenant Commander James Pirro, JAG Corps, the brother of the veteran who had died in Vale's program, was in the video, standing beside Vale, taking notes. Her phone rang. It was Sims, not a text this time. "Ms. Voss," Sims said. And her voice carried something that had not been there in the earlier call, a tightness, a controlled urgency. I need you to listen very carefully. The situation has just changed in a way I was not prepared for, and I need you to stay exactly where you are and not contact Marcus Hale until I tell you it's safe." Nora looked at the empty corridor, at the elevator doors that had closed on Vale, at the archive room door still ajar. "Why?" she said. "Because James Pirro has been missing for 6 hours," Sims said. "And the video you just sent me is the last documented record we have of him alive." The phone felt heavier than it should have. Nora held it against her ear and looked at the corridor and thought about the word alive specifically, about Sims's use of the past tense construction. "Last documented record we have of him alive," which was the careful language of someone in federal law enforcement who had been trained not to declare deaths before they were confirmed, and who was using that training right now to tell her something without saying it directly. "How long have you known Pirro was missing?" she said. "Since approximately 1900 hours, Sim said. "Before Marcus made contact with you at the lodge." Process that, he knew. Marcus was informed that Pirro had become unreachable. He was not told the full context. What is the full context? Pause the kind that contains a decision rather than a search for words. James Pirro contacted this office 8 days ago with information suggesting that his brother's death was not the only casualty connected to Vale's program, and that he had obtained documentation from inside the program independently. He was scheduled to brief our senior investigator the morning after he contacted us. Another pause. He never appeared. His apartment showed signs of a rapid, unforced departure. Personal vehicle was found at a marina in Gulf Breeze. Nora looked at the elevator doors. Vale had come up to this floor knowing the archive had been accessed. He had come up alone, no contractors, no hired men, which at the time had read as confidence but now recalibrated into something else. A man who was managing the situation personally, because the number of people he could trust had already become very small. "The video," she said. "Pirro is in the video. That doesn't make him complicit." "No," Sims agreed, "it doesn't. But it means he had direct visual access to what Vale was doing, and his independent documentation, whatever it contained, may be the piece that completes the picture of who knew what and when." A brief pause. "It also means Vale knows Pirro was documenting him. And Vale knows Pirro is the one who triggered this investigation. And if Pirro disappears before he can brief you," Nora said, "the only witness to the internal program is gone." "Yes, which means the video, the one I just sent you, is now the only evidence that Pirro was ever inside that program." "Yes," Sim said again. Then Ms. Voss, "Stay where you are. I have agents entering the building now. Do not let Vale leave that floor." Call ended. Nora looked at Reyes, who had caught enough of the conversation from 3 feet away that her expression had already changed. "Came up alone," Nora said. "He's still on this floor." Reyes reached for her radio. The logical place for Vale to go if he was managing this himself. If he had come up to either confront Nora or access something in the archive before the revocation locked him out, and if he understood that federal agents were entering the building below him, was not back to the elevator. A man who had spent 31 months building a program inside a hospital understood its geography in the same way she did. Service corridors, secondary stairwells, the fire exit on the northeast corner that opened to the maintenance lot rather than the monitored main entrance. She knew exactly where he was going. "East stairwell," she said. "Maintenance exit." Reyes related into the radio. The response came back clipped and immediate agents repositioning to the exterior, but from the main lot, which meant they'd need 40 seconds to reach the maintenance side. 40 seconds was too long. Nora was already moving. East corridor branched off the main ward at the ICU junction. She pushed through the fire door with her chair, the hydraulic resistance fighting her for a moment before giving, and came out into the narrower service hall. The linoleum here was a different color, a utilitarian gray that matched her memory of every late-night errand she'd run through this part of the building. Supply runs, equipment checks, 1,000 small logistical tasks that happened in the margins of a shift, and that nobody above charge nurse level ever thought about. Stairwell door was propped open with a door wedge. Recent. It hadn't been propped when they'd come through the floor. Stopped at the threshold. She couldn't follow him down. That was the plain, unambiguous fact of the stairwell. 12 inches too narrow for her chair at speed. The descent a physical impossibility without assistance she didn't have. She looked at the propped door and thought about the 40 seconds Reyes had estimated, and then she thought about what Sims had said last documented record we have of him alive, and thought about James Pirro, who had gone to a marina in Gulf Breeze and hadn't been seen since, and whose brother had died in a session room on this floor in a chair with sensor leads at his temples. Pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He picked up in 2 rings. Nora, Sims told you not to. Vale is in the East Service stairwell heading to the maintenance exit, she said. Reyes has agents repositioning, but they're 40 seconds out. A fraction of a second. Service stairwells. Second floor landing. Can hear him. He's above you. He'll pass you in 10 seconds. I know. A pause that contained a physical event she couldn't see. Atlas. She heard the dog's nails on concrete stairs, not the measured hospital floor cadence, but the rapid, purposeful rhythm of an animal moving with intent, and then she heard a sound that was Vale's voice. Sharp and startled, followed by the specific acoustic quality of something metal, hitting a concrete step and bouncing. Then nothing. Then Marcus. We have him. She let out a breath that she didn't have room to be embarrassed about. He's not armed, Marcus said. He had a phone and a USB drive. A brief pause. The drive has a Coastal View medical label on it. What's on it? I don't know yet. Another pause longer. He's asking for his attorney. Good, she said. That means he's done talking. She backed away from the stairwell door and returned to the nursing station, where Becca had watched the past 6 minutes with the expression of a person who has crossed from confusion into something quieter and more resolved. Reyes appeared from the elevator 2 minutes later, with 2 additional federal agents in plainclothes. They were followed, 3 minutes after that, by Marcus and Atlas in a pale, controlled Callum Vale with his hands behind his back and a look on his face that Nora had never seen there before. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't the benign authority she'd memorized. It was the expression of a man who has run his calculations and arrived at a number he wasn't expecting, and who is now managing the experience of that number rather than the situation itself. He looked at her as he passed the nursing station. She looked back. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she needed to say at 2:47 in the morning, in a corridor she'd worked in for 4 years, with federal agents processing the man who had put her in a wheelchair and spent 22 months watching her from a distance to make sure she stayed down. She just looked at him and let him see that she was still there, still upright, still in possession of everything he'd spent 22 months trying to take. The agents moved him toward the elevator. Becca, very quietly, said, "Good." The next 4 hours moved at the pace of institutional process, which is to say they moved slowly and with considerable paperwork. Federal agents secured Coastal View's neurology wing at 3 a.m., establishing a document hold on all research files and placing the department on administrative lockdown pending investigation review. The hospital's chief medical officer was reached by phone at his home in Pensacola Beach and arrived at the building at 4:15 in a state of visible shock that appeared entirely genuine. The board chair was notified by 4:30. Nora gave a preliminary statement in a small conference room on the second floor, seated at a table across from a federal investigator named Carver, who recorded everything and asked questions with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the value of what she was saying would not be fully apparent until it was. Cross-referenced against 462 files, a video recording, and whatever was on the drive Vale had been carrying when Atlas stopped him on the stairwell, told it in order. She had rehearsed the order in her head across 22 months. The chart, the protocol pages, the consent form alterations, the memo with the contractor identifier, the collapse in the supply corridor, the admission she couldn't remember clearly, the discharge she remembered too well, the board complaint that hadn't been filed yet but existed as a threat, the watcher in the cafeteria, the blank drive, the archive transfer. She told it in order, and she told it factually, and when Carver asked her to clarify something, she clarified it, and when he asked her to slow down, she slowed down, and by the time she was finished the recording had run for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Carver thanked her. She didn't register it. She was looking at the window of the conference room, the same flat bay view she'd looked at from the sky bridge earlier, now in the gray pre-dawn, and thinking about Piro, about the marina, about whether 48 hours mattered in the end. Marcus found her in the hallway outside the conference room at 6:20 a.m. He had the look of someone who had been awake for 24 hours and had stopped fighting it. Atlas walked beside him, with the same ground-covering calm he'd carried since the cafeteria, which now felt like several days ago, rather than the previous afternoon. The drive Vale was carrying, Marcus said without preamble. Sims's team just finished a preliminary review. She waited. It's not research data, he said. It's a contacts archive. Names, numbers, institutional affiliations, everyone who had knowledge of her financial stake in the Arcturus program. He paused. 37 names, 6 with current DoD affiliation. She sat with that for a moment. He was going to use it. As leverage, Marcus said. Yes. If the program went down, he wasn't going down alone. He had enough on enough people that he could have made things very complicated for a federal prosecution. He looked at her. He was carrying it to use, not to hide. He'd already decided he was past hiding. And now it's a federal exhibit, she said. And now it's a federal exhibit, he said. She almost smiled. Didn't quite reach it, Piero. Marcus's expression shifted in a way that was small but legible to her now, after a full day of reading him. Sims has a team at the marina. They found his car yesterday. They found something else this morning. She waited. Storage unit registered in a name that traces back to a Shell LLC, he said. Rented 6 weeks ago, Sims's team got a warrant at 6 a.m. Inside, they found documentation, physical copies, printed, organized. Piero's independent record of everything he'd seen inside Vale's program going back 19 months. He paused. And a note, addressed to the IG's office, dated the day before he disappeared. He knew they were coming for him, she said. He knew. Prepared. Marcus looked at the floor for a moment. No sign of him physically. They hadn't. He stopped. Started again. It's active. She understood what active meant. She let herself feel what she felt about it, the particular weight of a situation that was not resolved in the direction she'd needed it to resolve, and then she set it aside, not permanently, but to a place where it wouldn't interfere with the next thing that needed doing. The board complaint, she said. Vale was supposed to file at 6 a.m. His attorney received notice of federal detention at 5:53, Marcus said. Complaint was never filed. She looked at the window again. Outside, Pensacola was becoming visible in the morning light, the bay, the bridge in the distance, the buildings between the hospital and the water. She had looked at this view from inside this building hundreds of times and had not been able to stand at a window and feel what it looked like rather than what it meant in terms of how much of the shift remained. She looked at it now without that filter and found that it was, unremarkably and unexpectedly, very beautiful. I need sleep, she said. Yes, he said, and food. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I know. I haven't either. He looked slightly pained by this, which she found human and therefore reassuring. Diner 2 blocks west that opens at 7. 2 blocks is not an issue, she said. They went. Atlas walked between them on the sidewalk in the early morning light. The city was almost entirely quiet, and she ate scrambled eggs and toast and 2 cups of coffee, while Marcus ate something with considerably more protein and said very little, and the silence between them was the functional silence of 2 people who have been through something, together, and don't currently need to talk about it. Her phone rang at 8:14 a.m., Commander Sims, she answered. Ms. Voss, I wanted to give you a direct update before you heard anything through other channels. Sims's voice was back to its earlier precision, the controlled urgency gone, replaced by something deliberate and careful. Vale has been charged with 6 counts, including illegal human experimentation under federal research compliance statutes, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit assault, and 2 counts of obstruction. His attorneys entered an appearance 20 minutes ago. There will be a detention hearing tomorrow morning. Counts, Nora said, initial. The investigation is ongoing. Given the scope of the archive and the contacts drive, we anticipate additional charges as the review progresses. A pause. 37 names on the contacts drive. We've made contact with federal oversight for each of the DoD-affiliated individuals. That process will take time. And Piero? A pause that was different from the earlier one, shorter, more contained, as if Sims had been expecting the question and had already decided exactly what she could say. We have reason to believe he is alive. His documentation provides us significant additional evidentiary weight. Finding him is the current priority of a separate team. She paused. Can't give you more than that. I know, Nora said. Can give you this, Sims said. The hospital's board has been formally notified that your neurological file is under federal evidence review. Pending the outcome of that review, any administrative action against you, based on those records, is stayed. Additionally, the hospital's medical director has been asked to appoint an independent physician to review the original documentation of your injury and treatment. Another pause. That review will include the night you collapsed. Nora set down her coffee cup. Her hands were not shaking. She made a point of noticing that. Thank you, she said. Came out quieter than she intended. You did the hard work, Sims said. 22 months of it. And then in a slightly different register. Don't minimize that. Call ended. Marcus was looking at her across the diner table. Atlas had his chin on the bench seat beside her and was watching her with the same brown-eyed steadiness he'd aimed at her since the previous morning. She looked at the dog for a moment. Sims says Piero may be alive, she said. I know, Marcus said. She called me at the same time. He held his coffee. She also told me that the contacts drive has 3 names on it who have worked with federal law enforcement in advisory roles. Can't share who until they're interviewed, but it means there are people inside the system who knew about Arcturus and stayed quiet. People who could have helped, she said. Yes, earlier. When I was trying. He didn't look away from her. He didn't try to soften it. Yes. She sat with that. It was the part that didn't resolve cleanly, and she knew it wouldn't. The knowledge that the outcome she'd spent 22 months trying to reach had been reachable earlier, had been closer than she'd been allowed to know, had been delayed not by the weight of the evidence, but by the weight of the people positioned between the evidence and the people who could act on it. She sat with it and felt what it was and didn't try to make it something easier. The 17 subject identifiers, she said finally, in my original photographs. Do you know what happened to those patients? Sims's team is cross-referencing them against the full archive now, he said. Some of them are still in the system in other facilities, ongoing care. Some may have been discharged. Some he stopped. It's part of the investigation. I want to know, she said. When they know, I want to know. I'll make sure you're told, he said. She nodded. She looked out the diner window at the morning street ordinary traffic. A woman walking a small dog, a delivery truck double parked. The world conducting itself with complete indifference to what had happened inside a hospital 2 blocks away in the past 8 hours, which was both irritating and stabilizing, in the way that ordinary things often are after extraordinary ones. Her phone buzzed. Not a call, a news alert. From the Pensacola regional outlet, she'd kept notifications on since her collapse, because monitoring local coverage had been one of the few things she could do from a wheelchair to stay connected to the things that might matter. Federal agents seal Coastal View Medical Center Neurology Wing senior physician detained. Below it, a second alert from a national outlet, already picking it up. Naval IG office confirms active investigation into Coastal View Medical Research Program. Turned the phone toward Marcus. He read the alerts and set her phone down without comment. It's out, she said. It's out, he confirmed. The thing about information reaching the press, she knew, was that it changed the shape of everything that came after. Vale's attorneys would recalibrate. The 37 names on the contacts drive would recalibrate. People at the DoD who had oversight relationships with Arcturus and had remained quiet would recalibrate. The board at Coastal View, which had spent 22 months treating her concerns as a management problem, would recalibrate. Calculus of silence, which had been stable and profitable for a very long time, had just become unstable, and the transition would not be orderly. She had been the loose thread for 22 months. She understood now, with a clarity that was not satisfying exactly but was complete, that she had never been as alone in being that thread as she'd felt. The system around Vale had held because the people inside it believed the cost of pulling the thread was higher than the cost of leaving it. The evidence she'd transferred at 1:47 in the morning had changed that calculation for enough people that the system had stopped holding all at once. Eggs were going cold. She ate them anyway. At 9:30 a.m., she received a call from a number she didn't recognize, a Pensacola area code, local. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it, Ms. Voss. A man's voice measured with the specific register of someone choosing each word carefully. My name is Leonard Quarles. I'm the chair of the credentialing committee at Coastal View Medical Center. I'm calling to inform you that, effective this morning, your former clinical account has been flagged for administrative review, and that review will include a full reassessment of the circumstances under which your employment was terminated. A pause. I also want you to know that this call is unofficial. The formal process will take time, but I wanted you to hear it directly. She looked at Marcus across the table. Why unofficial, she said. Because the formal process is a pause. The formal process. And you've been waiting 22 months for someone to call who wasn't asking you to be quiet. Another pause. I should have called before now. The committee should have reviewed your case 18 months ago, when you first submitted your formal complaint to the board. We didn't. His voice didn't carry the slickness of legal preparation. Carried the specific discomfort of a person who is being honest about something they're not proud of. That's on the committee. She let the silence sit for a moment. I'll wait for the formal process, she said. Thank you for calling. She ended the call and looked at her phone and then at Marcus. Committee chair, she said. I heard, he said. Covering himself, yes, Marcus said. But he also called. She thought about that, the distinction between a person covering themselves and a person making a choice, and whether those could be the same action for different reasons, and whether the reason mattered as much as she'd always believed it did. She didn't arrive at a clean answer, which felt right. At 11 a.m., they went back to the Navy Lodge so she could sleep. She slept for 4 hours in a room with the curtains drawn, an atlas on the floor near the door, and when she swoke the sun had moved and the light under the curtains had changed, and for approximately 3 seconds she didn't know where she was or what had happened, and then she did, and she lay still for a moment, holding the full weight of it. Her phone had 7 messages. She looked at them in order. The first was from Carver, the federal investigator, confirming her statement had been logged, and that a follow-up would be scheduled in the coming days. The second was from Sims, a brief text. Review team has confirmed the 17 subject identifiers. 14 are alive and in current care, 3 deceased, including Sergeant Hero. Causes under review. The third was the news alert she'd expected. Vale's name now in national coverage. Coastal View named in a federal investigation. The phrases illegal experimentation and military veterans appearing in print for the first time. The fourth message stopped her. It was from an unknown number. Gulf Breeze area code. Text contained 3 lines. This is Piro. I'm alive. Sims knows. I went to ground when they started moving on you. I had to wait until it was safe to surface. You held longer than I thought anyone could. Thank you. She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone on the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt something shift inside her chest. A loosening of something she hadn't known was still clenched. It was not relief, exactly. It was the specific sensation of a weight she'd been carrying that belonged to someone else, the weight of being the only one, the weight of knowing what she knew in a space where no one else could see it settling out of her hands and into the larger shape of a story that now had more people in it than her. She sat up. She reached for her phone again and opened the message thread and typed back, "Glad you're alive. Talk when you're ready." She looked at the message for a moment before sending it. Then she sent it and got out of bed and opened the curtains. And the afternoon light came in flat and bright off the bay, and Atlas raised his head from the floor and looked at her. "I know," she said. "I'm up." She was in the small bathroom running water over her face when her phone rang, not Piro, not Sims, but the Coastal View main desk, which she recognized from the prefix, which she had not expected. She answered. It was the hospital's chief medical officer, the man who had arrived at 4 a.m. in visible shock, and who had spent the intervening hours, apparently, doing something more productive than she'd assumed. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'm calling because I've been asked by the board to initiate a formal request. We'd like you to serve on the independent review panel for the neurological research protocols. As a clinical consultant." He paused. "The federal investigators have also been asked to approve the appointment. Given the circumstances, we felt started again. We felt that the person who documented what was happening should be the person who helps determine how it's reviewed." She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked tired. She looked like herself. "I'll review the terms," she said. "Send them to me in writing." "Of course," he said. Call ended. She stood at the sink for a moment, looking at her own face, and thought about what it meant to be asked back into a room where you'd been told you no longer belonged, not as a concession, not as a settlement, but as someone whose presence was necessary because of what you'd done rather than in spite of it. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed one more time. Text from Marcus. "Come to the lobby when you're ready. Sims wants a briefing at 1700. There's something in the archive that she hasn't shown you yet." She looked at the message. Something in the archive she hasn't shown you yet. She read it twice, the way she'd read Piro's message, and felt the familiar cold settle into her chest, not the same cold as before. Not the cold of being alone with the knowledge, but the cold of a story that has more pieces than you've counted, and the understanding that the piece you're missing is not a minor one. She typed back, "What kind of something?" His reply came in 11 seconds. "Kind that means Vale wasn't running this alone from the beginning. Kind that goes higher than Arcturus." She set the phone down on the bathroom counter and looked at her reflection again, and thought about the 37 names on the contacts, drive specifically about the 6 with current DoD affiliation, and about Sims's careful language when she'd described them, and about the 3 names Sims had mentioned who had worked with federal law enforcement in advisory roles and couldn't be named yet. She thought about the video. Vale in the session room. Piro at the edge of the frame. The patient in the chair with the sensor leads and the slack, fixed stare. And she thought about the screen the patient had been looking at, the screen that was out of frame, that she hadn't been able to see. She hadn't thought to ask what was on it. She picked up her phone, typed, "I'll be down in 5 minutes." She looked at herself one more time in the mirror. Then she put the phone in her pocket, turned off the bathroom light, and went to find out what else the archive knew. The lobby smelled like coffee from the vending machine near the entrance. The bad kind. The kind that's been cycling in a heated coil since 6 in the morning, and Nora noticed it the way she noticed everything now, with the particular attentiveness of a person who has spent a day being very alert, and whose nervous system hasn't yet received the message that it's allowed to stand down. Marcus was by the window. Atlas was beside him, and when the dog saw her come through the corridor from the elevator, he stood up with the unhurried deliberateness he used for everything, and she found that she was genuinely glad to see him. It was not something she'd expected to be able to say about a dog she'd met 26 hours ago. "What's in the archive?" she said. Not a question. Marcus handed her a tablet. The screen showed a still image, a document, photographed from above with the clean resolution of a professional scanner, letterhead at the top. Not Coastal View letterhead. Not Arcturus letterhead. Department of Defense. Office of Defense Research and Engineering. She looked at it. "It's a program authorization," Marcus said. "Signed 14 months before Arcturus was registered as an LLC. Before Vail published his first federally funded paper on neuromodulation. Before the referral contract with the military medical system was put in place." He paused. Arcturus wasn't Vail's idea. Vail was brought in to run a program that already existed. Scrolled down on the tablet. The document was 8 pages. She read the relevant sections the way she read clinical documentation, for structure, for language, for what the words were designed to conceal by their precision. The program had a name, Linden. It was described as a feasibility study in adaptive compliance response optimization in high-stress cognitive environments, which was the kind of language that had clearly been written by someone who understood that the plainest version of what they were doing would not survive ethics review. Plainest version was, they had been testing whether targeted neurological intervention could reduce the capacity of traumatized veterans to resist institutional authority. Whether you could, in effect, make already damaged people more compliant, more willing to accept what they were told, less able to sustain objection, less capable of the specific cognitive resistance that made certain veterans difficult to manage in care settings. The word the document used for this was threshold optimization. She read the phrase twice. 14 months before Arcturus, she said. Program predates Vail's involvement by 2 years, Marcus said. Vail was the implementation mechanism. The research design came from somewhere else. Screen, she said, in the video. The patient was looking at a screen. It was part of the protocol. Yes. Sims's team found the session software in a protected partition of Vail's archive. It presented as a standard cognitive assessment interface. It wasn't. He was watching her read. It was the delivery mechanism. The neuromodulation calibration worked in conjunction with the visual stimulus paired exposure, timed to neurological response windows. The sensor leads weren't just monitoring, they were bidirectional, she said. Yes. She set the tablet down on the lobby coffee table and looked at it from a slight distance, which was something she'd learned to do with information that was hard to hold at close range. Looking at it from 2 feet further away didn't make it less true. It made it possible to continue functioning while receiving it. Who signed the authorization? She said. It was in the document she'd seen the signature block, but she needed to hear it said. A deputy director in the Office of Defense Research and Engineering named Warren Colt, Marcus said. He retired 16 months ago, 6 weeks after the IG's office received its first complaint about Coastal View. He's on the contacts drive. He's number 1 on the contacts drive, Marcus said. He's also the reason Sims has been careful about what she says out loud in certain rooms. She looked at him. She didn't know how deep it went. Expected. She needed evidence that connected the program to the authorization level. He sat down across from her. What you pulled from the archive last night, the correspondence folder, the Arcturus records buried in the metadata of the files, was a document reference number that traces back to the Linden authorization. Vail included it in his internal records as a liability hedge. The program went wrong. He wanted documentation that he was operating under explicit DoD authority. He was protecting himself from above. She said yes. And in doing so, he left a paper trail straight to Colt. Atlas came to her side and pressed his shoulder against her leg, a slow and entirely voluntary contact, and she put her hand on his back without thinking about it, and felt the steady warmth of him under her palm. Sims needs me at the briefing, she said. She needs your clinical read on the session protocol, Marcus said. The research methodology, whether the adverse events she's flagging, are consistent with the intervention described in the Linden documentation. Team has investigators. She needs someone who understands what they were doing to the patients physiologically. She needs a nurse, Nora said. She needs the specific nurse who was in that ward, who worked those patients. And who spent 22 months being told she didn't know what she'd seen, Marcus said. His voice was even. It wasn't flattery. It was a list of qualifications. The briefing was at a federal field office 12 minutes from the hospital, a nondescript building in a Pensacola commercial district that looked like an insurance company from the outside and had badge readers on every interior door. Sims was already there when they arrived, along with Carver and two analysts Nora hadn't met, and a woman introduced as doctor. Paulette Mbeki, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, who had been flown in overnight as an independent expert reviewer. Sims shook Nora's hand. It was a firm, brief handshake, the handshake of a person who respects time and uses physical contact to convey information rather than perform warmth. "Thank you for coming," Sims said. "You said there was something in the archive," Nora said. "Several things," Sims said. "We'll go through them." They went through them for 3 hours. Nora sat at a conference table with the Linden documentation, Vail's session logs, the adverse event reports, and the Arcturus correspondence, and she worked through it the way she'd worked through difficult clinical cases in her previous life, methodically, starting from what was known and building outward, noting where the documentation contradicted itself, where the language shifted from clinical to administrative in ways that flagged deliberate concealment, where the outcomes described didn't match the protocols that should have produced them. Adverse events were the most damaging part. Vail had filed internal reports not with the IRB, not with any regulatory body, but internally, in the protected partition, Sims's team had found documenting 17 instances of unexpected neurological response in program participants. Of those 17, 6 had resulted in what Vail's documentation called sustained compliance state, which, cross-referenced against the session software and the patient records, translated to something considerably more alarming. Patients who had entered the program with normal capacity for autonomous decision-making and had left it with measurably reduced ability to initiate or sustain objection to medical authority. 3 of those 6 patients were among the 14 currently in care that Sims had mentioned in her morning text. Nora read the case summaries. She read them carefully. She read them the way she'd learned to read difficult things, without letting the weight of them land all at once, parceling it out in the measured doses that allowed her to keep processing rather than stopping. Then she set the summaries down and told Sims exactly what she was looking at in clinical terms and what it meant for the patients currently in care and what intervention protocol she would recommend, and which of the 6 cases required immediate neurological reassessment by someone independent of any facility that had previously treated them through the military referral system. And Becky was taking notes. Sims was recording. Carver, at one point, looked up from his own documentation and said, "You were a trauma nurse." "Yes," Nora said. "This analysis," he said, gesturing at the summary she'd just walked them through, "is not what I'd expect from a trauma nurse. I've had 22 months to become familiar with neuromodulation research methodology," she said. "Specific reason to learn it." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man revising an assumption, which she had long since decided was the most useful thing a person in a position of institutional authority could do. The briefing ended at 8 p.m. Outside, the Pensacola evening was warm and salt-smelling, the kind of air that reminds you the ocean is close even when you can't see it. She sat beside Marcus on a low concrete barrier in the parking lot, while Atlas investigated the perimeter of the building with the methodical interest of an animal who has earned the right to follow his curiosity. "Colt," she said, "what happens to him?" "The contacts drive goes to the DOJ," Marcus said. "The Linden authorization document goes with it. Colt's retirement doesn't insulate him. The authorization predates his retirement by 14 months, and the program continued operating after he left, which means the question of ongoing oversight is a separate liability from the original authorization." He looked at the evening sky. "Take time. Federal prosecution of a former DOD official is not a 2-week process. But it starts," she said. "It started this morning," he said, "when Sims filed the preliminary report." She thought about that, about starting, about the difference between the moment a thing begins and the moment it becomes visible. Linden had started years before she'd found the chart. The harm had started before the program had a name. The accountability was starting now, in federal documentation and preliminary reports, and the quiet movement of information through the specific channels that existed to receive it. And it would not look like what she'd imagined for 22 months, because the thing she'd imagined was simpler and faster and more directly satisfying than the actual process of institutional consequence. But it was real. That was the thing she kept coming back to. It was real, and it was moving, and it could not be stopped by a text message or a blank drive, or 3 men in visitor lanyards or a board complaint that had never been filed. The 3 patients, she said. The ones with sustained compliance state. They need someone advocating for them through the reassessment process. Yes, Mark said. I want to be involved in that. He looked at her. Not surprised, I'll tell Sims. I'm not asking for permission, she said. I'm telling you what I'm doing. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it. I know, he said. 3 weeks moved the way recovery moves, not steadily. Not in a clean upward line, but in the jagged, uneven rhythm of a process that involves simultaneous progress and setback, and the occasional day where you can't tell which is which. Vale's detention hearing resulted in remand without bail. His attorney had entered a plea of not guilty on all 6 initial charges, and the motion to suppress the archive evidence on the grounds of improper access had been filed and denied within 48 hours. Nora's clinical credentials and the formal federal access protocol under which she'd logged in at 1:47 a.m. had been sufficient to establish legitimate chain of custody. The motion's denial had made brief national news, which meant that people who had not previously known the name Callum Vale or the program he'd run were now reading about it over breakfast. Warren Colt was identified publicly in the 3rd week, when the DOJ issued a formal notice of investigation that named him as a subject rather than a witness. He had, in the intervening weeks, hired 2 of the most prominent federal defense attorneys in Washington and issued a statement through them that described the Linden program as a lawfully authorized research initiative operating within appropriate oversight channels. The statement was careful and precise and carried the marks of people who were very good at their jobs. It also landed in a news environment that now had access to Nora's clinical summary, which had been entered into the federal record, and which Sims had authorized for limited public release in the interest of informing the individuals who had participated in the program and might not know it. Clinical summary described, in plain and specific terms, what threshold optimization meant for the 6 patients whose neurological function had been measurably altered. It described it the way Nora had described it in the briefing, without rhetorical excess, without the kind of language that signals agenda, in the flat clinical register that was, paradoxically, far more damaging than outrage would have been, because it couldn't be dismissed as emotional. Colt's statement did not survive the week. She heard about the Colt development from Sims on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the cafeteria. She was at Coastal View, not in the cafeteria this time, but on the 3rd floor, in a temporary consulting space the hospital had set up for the independent review panel she'd agreed to join. The panel had 5 members: Mbeki, 2 independent clinical reviewers, a patient advocate from a veteran service organization, and Nora. They met twice weekly and were working through the full archive systematically, which was slow and sometimes difficult, and occasionally surfaced things that required her to set the documentation down and look at the window for a moment before continuing. She had gotten good at continuing. Her phone rang while she was reviewing a session log from 18 months prior, and she answered it without looking at the caller because she was mid-thought, and the thought was important. Ms. Voss, Sims's voice. The independent medical review of your neurological file is complete. She set the session log down. The reviewing physician's finding is that the documentation of your collapse and subsequent diagnosis is inconsistent with the clinical presentation described in the admitting notes, Sims said. Specifically, the progression rate described in Vale's documentation is not consistent with idiopathic onset at the severity recorded. There are also 2 medications listed in your acute treatment record that night that the reviewing physician flagged as inconsistent with standard neurological emergency protocol. A pause. The finding has been submitted to the state medical board. A formal investigation has been opened. Nora looked at the window. Outside, the bay was doing what it always did, moving. Indifferent, bright in the morning light. The state board, she said. Not just the hospital. The state board, Sims confirmed. Because the review finding raises questions about whether what happened to you in that corridor was an accident, and that's a question that requires more than a hospital-level review. She'd known this was the direction it was heading. She'd known it since the briefing, since reading Vale's adverse event reports, since understanding what threshold optimization looked like in practice. She'd known it, and knowing it hadn't prevented the specific quality of the silence that fell on her now. The silence of having said something for 22 months that everyone around her had treated as the understandable grievance of a damaged woman, and hearing it now reflected back in the language of a formal medical finding. Thank you, she said. She kept her voice level. She didn't perform steadiness because she was actually steady, not because it was easy, but because she had gotten good at that, too. One more thing, Sims said. James Perrow would like to speak with you. When you're ready. He's been debriefed and he's been told what you did, the timeline, the archive, the submission. A pause. He wanted to say it himself. I'll call him today, she said. She did. The call lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than she expected and shorter than the conversation warranted. Piro's voice was the voice of a man who had spent 3 weeks in a rented room in Mobile, Alabama, following the investigation through news alerts and secure communications with Sims, knowing what was moving and unable to affect it, which she recognized as a particular kind of difficult that was different from her own 22 months, but not unrelated to it. I should have found you sooner. I had your name in my files for 8 months before He stopped. Kept thinking I could build enough of a case independently that I wouldn't need to involve a civilian. I'm not a civilian, she said. I was a military trauma nurse. I know, he said. I know that now. A pause. I'm sorry. She didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine, and she'd decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to perform the absolution that people expected when they apologized for things that had cost her something real. I understand why you made the choices you made, she said instead. That's enough. It was enough. James Piro testified before a federal grand jury 6 weeks after the cafeteria. His testimony, combined with the archive evidence, the Linden authorization document, and the clinical findings from Nora's review panel, was sufficient for the DOJ to expand the indictment. Vale faced 11 charges at arraignment, including 3 counts of aggravated assault under Federal Medical Statutes 1 for each of the 6 patients with measurable neurological alteration, reduced to 3 in the initial indictment, with the remaining 3 under continued investigation. Warren Colt was indicted on 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 count of federal research fraud. 4 additional individuals from the contacts drive, 2 with current institutional affiliations, were named as co-conspirators. The arraignment was covered nationally. Nora watched it on a laptop in the consulting space on the 3rd floor of Coastal View, alone except for Atlas, who had become a semi-regular presence in the building because Marcus had been working with Sims's team on site, and because Atlas had, in the opinion of approximately everyone on the 3rd floor nursing staff, earned the right to be wherever he wanted. She watched the coverage for 20 minutes. She watched Vale enter the courtroom and sit at the defense table and maintain the composed, authoritative expression he'd maintained in the corridor 3 weeks earlier, and she watched the reading of the charges strip that expression down layer by layer, not all at once but in small increments, each count landing in the formal, public record with the weight of something that could not now be taken back or managed or reframed through a board complaint or a careful memo. She turned the laptop off before the coverage ended. She'd seen what she needed to see. Atlas put his head on her knee, put her hand on his neck, and sat there for a moment in the quiet of a building she'd once moved through, fast and purposeful, and had then moved through diminished and watched, and had now moved through again, slowly and in a wheelchair, doing work that required everything she had. Credentialing Committee's formal review of her employment termination concluded in the 7th week. The finding was issued in a document that was 14 pages long, and that she read once completely before setting it aside. The relevant finding was on page 9. Her termination had not been supported by documented performance deficiencies, and had occurred under circumstances that, in light of the current federal investigation, warranted reclassification as retaliatory discharge. The hospital's board had voted unanimously to offer reinstatement. She didn't take reinstatement. The consulting role was what she wanted, the structured independence of it, the ability to move between the clinical space and the oversight space without being confined to either, countered with a formal consulting contract, permanent panel membership, and a specific mandate. She would serve as the clinical liaison between the hospital's neurology department and the patients who had been enrolled in Vale's program without informed consent, for as long as those patients required advocacy. The board accepted. The chief medical officer called to confirm personally, and she detected in his voice the specific relief of someone who had been afraid the answer would be no, which she noted without finding it satisfying in the way she might have expected. She was too tired for the satisfaction of making people afraid. That had never been the point. The 3 patients with sustained compliance state were the hardest cases. She had known they would be. She had known it from the moment she'd read the adverse event reports and understood what threshold optimization looked like in the long-term outcome data. 2 of them were at a VA facility in Tallahassee, both men in their 30s, both with TBI histories predating their enrollment in Vale's program, both presenting with what their current care teams had documented as unusual treatment compliance and reduced patient-initiated communication. She drove to Tallahassee on a Thursday with the review panel's formal authority to request record tasks and to be present for the independent neurological assessments Mbeki had arranged. She didn't fix anything on that trip. She sat in 2 assessment rooms, listened to 2 patients describe their experiences in the flat, slightly underwater way of people whose capacity for sustained protest has been blunted, and took notes and asked questions, and made sure that the independent neurologist conducting the assessment had the full clinical context from the Linden session logs. She did not fix anything. She made sure the right people were in the room with the right information. It was the work. It was slow and unglamorous, and sometimes it required her to drive 4 hours for a 2-hour meeting and drive back the same day. And on the way home, she sometimes sat in the parking lot of a rest stop on I-10 and did not particularly feel like the person who had brought down a federal research program. She felt like a tired woman in a hand-control sedan who needed 15 minutes before she could complete the drive. Took them. Then she completed the drive. The 3rd patient with sustained compliance state was a woman 31 years old, former Army medic, enrolled in Vail's program after a blast injury that had left her with moderate TBI and PTSD. Her name was Sergeant Cora Ellison, and she was currently at a facility in Biloxi, and she was the one whose case had been in the back of Nora's mind since she'd first read the adverse event summary, because Ellison's session log showed the highest number of interventions of the 6 flagged cases, and because her intake record showed that she had, prior to enrollment, submitted 2 formal complaints about her care complaints that had been routed to Vail's department and had not been forwarded to the facility's patient advocacy office. She had been a person who objected, and she had been put into a program that was designed to reduce her capacity for objection. Nora thought about that on the drive to Biloxi. She thought about it without making it about herself, because it wasn't about herself, and she had enough clinical discipline to maintain that distinction most of the time. She thought about it as what it was, a pattern that said something about who the program had selected and why, and what the people running it had understood about which patients were likely to see through what was being done to them. She met Cora Ellison in a day room with afternoon light coming through institutional windows. Ellison was a small, dark-haired woman with the specific physical economy of someone whose body had been trained to be efficient with its energy and was still doing that even when it didn't need to. She shook Nora's hand and looked at her with the slightly dampened directness of someone whose affect had been altered, but whose underlying intelligence was still entirely present. "You're the nurse," Ellison said. "Yes," Nora said. "Told me you found the records." "I found part of them," Nora said. "Other people helped find the rest." Ellison looked at her for a moment. "They keep telling me the way I feel now, the way I don't push back on things they keep saying it might get better." She said it without self-pity, with a clinical detachment that was clearly her own training talking. "Is that true?" Nora told her the truth. "We don't know yet. Becky, the neurologist reviewing your case, she thinks there's reason for cautious optimism. The intervention was neurological, and neurology has more plasticity than we used to believe. But I won't tell you it's certain, because I don't know that, and you deserve a straight answer." Ellison looked at her for another moment. Something moved in her face, not emotion exactly, but the recognition of a person who has been spoken to directly after a long period of not being. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Nora said. They talked for 2 more hours. Not about the case, about Ellison's service, her training, the blast injury, the specific texture of the months before she'd been transferred to Vail's program. Nora listened. She was very good at listening, better than she'd been before the wheelchair, because the wheelchair had taught her, slowly and against her will, that there was information in what people said when they didn't think you were capable of doing anything with it. On the drive back to Pensacola, she called Marcus. "Ellison," she said. "She needs long-term advocacy. Someone who isn't institution affiliated." "I know," he said. "Hero is working with a veterans advocacy organization. They're building a specific support structure for the program participants. Ellison is already on the list." "Good," she said. "Then how's Atlas?" A brief pause. "Annoyed that you're not here. Keep sitting by the door." She smiled. Actually smiled. The full version. The one that reached places she'd kept closed for a long time. "I'll be back in 3 hours," she said. "He'll manage," Marcus said. The charges against Vail went to trial 7 months after the cafeteria. She was not in the courtroom for the opening. She was in Tallahassee for the follow-up assessment of the 2 patients there, which she'd scheduled before she knew the trial date, declined to move it, because those patients' assessments did not become less important because of a scheduling conflict. She followed the trial coverage on her phone in the evenings. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. She was in the consulting space on the 3rd floor, reviewing panel documentation for the quarterly report she'd be delivering to the board the following week when Sims called. Guilty on 9 of 11 counts, Sims said, sentencing in 60 days. Which two? The 2 counts related to Ellison's specific intervention due to insufficient chain of documentation for that individual session. The evidence was strong on everything else. A pause. The judge called the program a systematic exploitation of the country's most vulnerable patients. It's in the public record. Nora held the phone. Call, she said. Plea agreement announced this morning. 22 months federal. Forfeiture of pension. Permanent bar from federal employment or contracting. Another pause. He cooperated with the DOJ on the additional co-conspirators. Got him the plea. 22 months. I know, Sims said. The number was not an accident. She knew that Sims knew it was not an accident. She also knew that the federal sentencing guidelines for Cult's charges, weighted against his cooperation value, had produced that number through a process that had nothing to do with her 22 months and everything to do with prosecutorial calculus, and that the coincidence was a coincidence rather than a design. She sat with it anyway. She let herself feel the full, complex, imperfect weight of what it meant that the man who had authorized Lyndon would serve the same number of months that she had spent in a wheelchair, trying to get someone to hear her. Then she said, "Thank you for calling me directly." "Of course," Sims said. "What happens to the program documentation?" "The Lyndon records. Federal Evidence Archive for the duration of all related proceedings, then a structured declassification review. Given the public interest in the case, the DOJ is recommending full declassification within 18 months. A pause. Pushed for that. I thought you should know. She looked at the window. The bay was still out there, still moving, still carrying the particular quality of light that Pensacola produced in the late afternoon golden, slightly hazy, kind of light that makes everything look like it's almost over and just beginning at the same time. "Sims," she said. "Yes, when you received the first anonymous complaint about Coastal View, before Pierrot's family filed, before any of this did you look at it?" Pause, longer than the others. "I looked at it," Sims said. "I signed it a preliminary review rating. It didn't meet the threshold for escalation at the time, based on the available documentation." A pause. "Thought about that a lot, so have I," Nora said. "I submitted a complaint 18 months ago. It was rated the same way." "I know," Sims said. "I found it. It's in my file." Another pause. "I'm sorry." Nora took a breath. "I believe you," she said. "As far as I can go with it right now." "That's fair," Sims said. It was exactly as fair as she could make it. On a Friday afternoon 9 months after she'd sat in a cafeteria and watched a dog stand up for a reason she didn't yet understand. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the consulting space that had become, over the past months, a place she recognized as hers, in the specific way that only work that matters can make a space feel like yours. She had a plant on the windowsill, a small, unremarkable succulent that Becca had brought her in the 3rd week, with the explanation that the space needed something living in it, which was true. She looked at the plant, and the window, and the bay beyond it. She was not healed. That was the honest version. The injury to her spinal cord was real and ongoing, and the independent medical review had established that it was likely the result of a deliberate neurological intervention rather than spontaneous onset, which meant that whatever Vale had done to her on the night she collapsed in the supply corridor had caused real physical damage that had not resolved and might not fully resolve. She was not healed. She was functional, which was different, and she had learned to work with functional in ways she hadn't known she was capable of. She had also, slowly and without much ceremony, stopped describing herself to herself as a former trauma nurse. She was a nurse who had not practiced at the bedside for 22 months and who was currently practicing in a different register, in a chair, with a different set of tools. The work was the same. The knowledge was the same. The thing that had made her good at the job, the capacity to stay in a difficult room and keep thinking clearly and care about the person in front of her without losing the clinical piece that had not gone anywhere. It had, if anything, gotten sharper. She gathered her documentation and put on her coat. In the hallway, she ran into Becca, actually ran into her, chair wheel to ankle, because the corridor junction was blind, and they both came around it at the same moment. Becca said ow, and then looked at her and laughed. The unguarded laugh of someone who is genuinely amused, and Nora found herself laughing too, not at the collision, but at the fact of being there, being in the corridor at the end of a Friday, in a hospital where she had once been a problem to be managed, and was now a person, with a plant on her windowsill and a panel report to deliver next week. Verdict came in, Becca said. I heard, Nora said. How do you feel? She thought about it. She gave the Vrlzer rather than the easy one. Tired. Relieved. Still thinking about 3 patients in Tallahassee and 1 in Biloxi. She paused. Not done. Not done, Becca said. That's not a bad way to feel. No, she said. I guess it isn't. She went down to the lobby. Marcus was there. He'd developed the habit of finishing his work in the building when she was on the 3rd floor, which was not a thing either of them had discussed or formalized, and she had decided not to make it into something it wasn't, and also not to pretend she didn't notice it. Atlas was beside him, and when the dog saw her come through the stairwell door, she'd started taking the stairs in the sections where they had the wide, ramped alternative routes, because it was good for her upper body, and she'd decided to stop accommodating herself, less than the situation required. He stood, and walked toward her with the same deliberate, purposeful calm he'd brought to every moment, since the day he'd sat down beside her wheelchair in the cafeteria, and decided she was worth protecting. Put her hand on his head. He leaned into it. Verdict? Marcus asked. 9 of 11. He nodded. He didn't say good, which she appreciated, because good was insufficient, and he understood that. Colt pled this morning, she said. 22 months. Quiet for a moment. How are you with that? Working on it, she said. Ask me in a week. He nodded again. He understood the distinction between a question deserving an immediate answer and one deserving actual time. They walked out of the building together through the main entrance this time, not the service door, not the sky bridge, not the maintenance path. Through the main entrance, past the reception desk, where 2 staff members looked up and did not look away in the careful manner of people managing uncertainty, but simply looked, the way you look at someone you recognize. Outside, the evening was coming in off the bay. Warm and salt-edged, the kind of evening that Pensacola produced in the hours before full dark, when the light went sideways and turned everything briefly golden. Stopped on the concrete approach and looked at the building, the plain, functional exterior of Coastal View Medical Center, the building she'd spent 4 years moving through fast and certain, and had then spent 22 months navigating around, and had now spent 9 months returning to, day by day, on different terms. I was afraid to come back, she said. Not to Marcus specifically. Just said it. I know, he said. Not of Vale. Of what it would feel like to be here and not be who I was here. She looked at the entrance doors. Turns out it feels like being who I am here. Which is different. She paused. Not worse. Atlas was sitting beside her, looking at the evening with the equable attentiveness he brought to everything. And she looked at him and thought about the morning he'd sat down beside her wheelchair in the cafeteria, an animal who had seen enough of the world to trust his own judgment about people, who had put himself between her and the door before either of them had said a word, who had known something she hadn't known yet, which was that she was worth staying beside. He didn't react to me, she said. He reacted to the threat. But he stayed with me. He stayed with you, Marcus said. Threat was the reason he moved. Staying was a choice. She thought about that. She had spent 22 months being told, in explicit and implicit and institutional and interpersonal ways, that the space she occupied was too small to matter, that the things she'd seen and documented and tried to report were the concerns of a damaged woman in a wheelchair, manageable rather than credible, containable rather than dangerous. She had spent those months knowing what she knew, and holding it and looking for the door that would finally open, and the door had opened, not because she'd become more convincing or more credentialed, or more of the things the people in authority told her she needed to be, but because she'd held long enough and accurately enough that the evidence had finally met the moment that could receive it. That was not a lesson about patience. It was a lesson about the difference between being small and being underestimated, and about what becomes possible when the people doing the underestimating finally run out of room to maneuver. She had not been small. She had been unsupported. Those were different things, and the 22 months had felt the same either way, but the difference mattered now. At the end of a Friday in the fading light, standing in front of the building that had tried to contain her and had failed. Okay, she said. She pushed forward. The evening air came in off the water, salt and warm and indifferent, and Atlas walked beside her, and Marcus walked on her other side, and she moved through the parking lot toward the car, with the hand controls, and the 3-hour drive back through the kind of ordinary Florida evening that has no interest in whether you are diminished or vindicated or somewhere in the complicated human territory between those two things. She had things to do next week, the quarterly report, Ellison's follow-up assessment, a meeting with the Veterans Advocacy Organization about long-term support structure for the other patients, a phone call with the independent neurologist who was reviewing her own case not for the medical board, not for the federal record, but for her, because she'd finally decided she deserved to understand in clinical terms what had been done to her body and what it, realistically, to expect from it going forward. She had things to do, and she was tired, and the work was hard, and none of it was finished. She understood, in a way she hadn't quite understood before the cafeteria, before the drive and the archive and the corridor, and the long, careful months of returning, that it was never going to be finished in the way she'd imagined, the clean, total resolution of a story that was done, that could be set down. It was going to be ongoing. The patients were ongoing. The advocacy was ongoing. The question of what she was now, in this body and this life, was ongoing. She had stopped waiting for the finished version. The people who had put her in a wheelchair and told her to stay there had counted on her needing the finished version before she could move. They had counted on the weight of incompleteness keeping her still. They had underestimated what a person is capable of carrying forward, imperfectly, without resolution, without certainty, on nothing more substantial than the knowledge that the truth is worth the cost of saying it out loud. She got in the car. Atlas settled in the back. Marcus drove. She watched the hospital shrink in the side mirror as they pulled out of the lot, the building getting smaller, the evening getting darker, the bay visible for a moment between two office buildings and then gone. She faced forward.